Konami was possibly the #1 greatest game developer of the 80s and 90s, responsible for some of the most classic gaming franchises and blockbusters of all time. Konami games had a level of quality that was hard to match, and Konami loved shooters, like really loved shooters. And in this video, I'm gonna rank and review every single one of them. Variants on computer and console, enhanced versions and hacks that improve the experience, even hidden shooting games within other games. And you'll even get a little history along the way. I have to mention the awesome Konami Shooters book by Hardcore 101. Essential reading for any Konami or shooting fan with massive amounts of detail. So without further ado, the legendary library of Konami shooters, starting with their most beloved and iconic shooting franchise, Gradius. Gradius is easily the most important side-scrolling shooter of all time. Yes, even more than R-Type. Originally meant to be a sequel to Scramble, Konami's first major shooting hit in 1981, a game that set the foundation for all horizontal shooters. But it was Gradius in 1985 that lit the shooting world on fire. Literally, the first horizontal shooting game to turn the concept into an experience that you wanted to replay, not just for the addicting and challenging gameplay or for score, but for the visuals and music that went along with it. Dazzling players with varied level environments and creativity, and a sound chip that, while rudimentary, could do Miki Higashino's incredible compositions justice. The hardware did have its limitations, with some serious slowdown in parts of the game, especially when carrying a full set of options and the laser weapon. Of course, Gradius is most known for its unique and flexible power-up system that lets you customize your upgrade path dynamically as you play. It added a level of strategy and resource management that kept you on your toes. There were segments like this tricky Volcano Stage mini-boss that's much more easily dispatched by switching to the two-way shot. Now, the Gradius series wasn't perfect, at least the arcade games, especially when it came to difficulty balance. If you were good enough to power up quickly and keep your loadout, the game became far easier as you mowed down most obstacles and enemies. But make a silly mistake and die, losing it all and going back to a checkpoint, and certain parts become nearly impossible, forcing you to dodge like crazy while trying to speed and power back up. So much so that the series became known for it and coined the term Gradius Syndrome. But if you ask me, it's these moments of recovery that made Gradius the most fun. It certainly wasn't enough to keep players away, as Gradius became an arcade hit. Not only in Japan, but in the UK as well, where it was called Nemesis and ended up the highest grossing of 1986. And of all the Gradius arcade releases, it's the original that was the most playable and accessible to the masses. Due to its popularity, Gradius was released on nearly every platform available at the time, consoles and computers alike. In the US, the NES port was the first time most of us experienced the game, and while it was obviously downgraded in graphics and sound, as well as other limitations like limited options and bullets, it was the perfect entry-level Gradius game for new fans, and was how I first played it. Famitsu magazine even awarded it Best Shooting Game of the Year on the console, and I often recommend the NES port to new players as a perfect way to learn Gradius mechanics. But the best home port to this day remains on the PC Engine. And that includes the later arcade-accurate deluxe packs on the Saturn and PlayStation, because instead of simply porting it arcade perfect, Konami actually improved it. Colors are more vibrant, and the chiptunes are absolutely fantastic. Much more pleasing to the ear than the harsher arcade hardware. It sports an extra exclusive stage along with hidden stages, and the gameplay is rebalanced, more accessible than the arcade original, but not as entry level as the NES port. It's also not perfect, as due to a lower resolution, The screen scrolls slightly upward and down when moving, but to this day, it's the version that I play most and love. Now that doesn't mean that the other ports were chopped liver, with hardware limitations creating choppy scrolling, or compromised to the point where it's hard to recognize. The MSX version had its pros and cons, with the aforementioned choppiness making it harder to play. But I have to mention the excellent enhanced patch, which completely updates the graphics, speeds up the game and fixes the choppiness, upgrades the music and even adds voices, and is just an all-around unique version to play. Not to mention, it also includes the extra and bonus stages of the PC Engine. It's one of the coolest alternate versions around. To be honest, there's so many versions and ports of the original Gradius, you could make a special video just for them, which is a testament to how seminal it was in the pantheon of horizontal scrolling shooters. And while the sequels incrementally improved and perfected on the early formula, Gradius still holds up, and the music, timeless. When a new player wants to get into the genre, especially the Gradius series, it's the original game that I recommend first. The perfect trainer for so many shooting game skills that most of us take for granted, but learned so long ago. And it was Konami that set that cornerstone. I'll say it again, in 1985, the original Gradius was an experience. And I'll say it again, it still holds up. That's an S-tier game in my book, and the Konami shooting classic. Rewind 4 years to 1981, when Konami released the first ever forced scrolling horizontal shooter, Scramble. And for its time, aside from being revolutionary in terms of gameplay, it was actually pretty good. I'll admit, visually, it's not gonna win any beauty pageants with some pretty garish color schemes. And there's no music to speak of. It was before my time, coming out when I was only 4 years old and just barely starting to get my ass kicked, playing Defender on an Atari 2600. But that's how games were in 1981. Think about this. Scramble released almost 2 years before Xevious, and just after Defender that next year. There was nothing else like it. Those garish colors attracted players to the cabinet, and many games like Irem's Moon Patrol followed in their footsteps. The main gimmick is fuel, bombing the tanks below to keep from running out and forcing a game over a very short run of a few minutes only, before you eventually enter the final area with some Konami buildings, bomb the last target, and then the game loops. Later that year, another variant, or some say sequel, called Super Cobra was released, replacing your rocket with a chopper, changing up the look and layouts of stages, while also lengthening the game and upping the difficulty quite a bit. Both Scramble and Super Cobra saw a bunch of home ports, one of the coolest being the Vectrex port, using vector graphics and a background overlay to cool effect. Super Cobra even had various standalone tabletop units made. The usual battery of home computers, of course, had to get a port from Atari and Television, ColecoVision, and more. Some were quite playable, and others, not so much. It even got later ports like on the Game Boy Advance, and a graphically enhanced version on the Xbox 360. Not to mention a very recent Arcade Archives release on Switch and PS4. Like many games in the very early days, Scramble is simply well-executed fun and impossible to rank. It's simply unfair to judge by modern standards. Given the limitations in 81, historically and in terms of importance, Scramble is like Xevious, or like trying to rank Space Invaders. All of these arcade classics fall into a new rank category for me, H, for historic, which was universally praised and lauded by players and critics alike in 1981, and not a game that I, or most of us really, deserve to rank. It's the prototype to what would become the side-scrolling horizontal shooter. For Konami, the early years were mostly experimental. Instead of pushing out sequel after sequel, every year saw release of new concepts and ideas. Time Pilot was a perfect example, released a year later after Scramble, a completely different take on the genre where your ship position stays fixed in the center of the screen, and the scrolling moves the direction you're facing. So you're not so much dodging, as you are shooting and manipulating the screen position of the enemies and bullets, picking up, parachuting little dudes along the way. The kind of game you needed to grow up with and play as a kid during the 80s to appreciate, as of course it's quite simple by today's standards. Simple doesn't translate to easy though, as these games were all about score, and surviving long enough to end up on the leaderboard was a big part of the appeal. The original concept was all about traveling through time, fighting against craft from each era, starting in 1910 and ending up in, 2001. Thankfully, we haven't been invaded by UFOs. Yet. Or at least that we know of. And again, due to Time Pilot's success, it saw a host of ports across many consoles and computers. There was also an obscure sequel in 1984 which saw no ports at all, but mainly improved the graphics, increased the difficulty, and added missiles which were needed to destroy certain enemies. Unlike the scrolling shooter, Time Pilot's core gameplay never took off. And I admit, it's not something that keeps my attention for too long, but I know others who grew up with it and absolutely adore it. Nostalgia is a hell of a drug. It is fast, frantic, plays smoothly, and an inventive concept for 1982. It may not have influenced the genre, like Scramble, but it's still a very solid game that deserves respect as one of Konami's early successful innovations. Imagine playing Tempest while listening to a tranced out version of Bach. That's Gyrus in a nutshell, released just 1 year after Time Pilot and never getting a sequel. It still did well enough in arcades to get ports on the NES and Game Boy, and later even on PlayStation and Xbox Live. And that's because Gyrus is pretty dang fun, even if it gets repetitive after a while. The music definitely goes a long way, and keeps you jamming since the tune is so memorable. But unlike Tempest, which used a rotary knob in arcades, Gyrus did not. My best memories with Gyrus was on NES, as it's enhanced quite a bit over the early arcade game, as it should be for a game that released almost several years later. Better graphics, even better music, especially on the Famicom. Weapon upgrades, new enemies, extra stages, mid-bosses and more. Just a great upgrade by Konami, who clearly wanted to add to the game in a way they couldn't back in '83. Now the arcade version definitely has some better depth perception as the enemies approach, and it's pretty impressive for its time. Doesn't hurt that it was designed by Yoshiki Okamoto, who eventually left Konami for Capcom and ended up working on Street Fighter II, Final Fight, and Resident Evil. So yeah, he's probably kind of a genius. But if I had to rate my favorite and expanded version on NES, considering its age and the source, I'd give it a B. But at the time of arcade release back in '83, I'd imagine that jamming to that music would make you bok shit crazy. '85 was a big year for Konami, as it wasn't just the start of a single big franchise with Gradius, but a second, arguably even bigger franchise with Twinbee. Possibly the first ever effective Q-em-up, where the adorable, cartoony characters and art style was a major selling point of the game, even if it didn't look it at first, to the point where the titular characters became a pop culture phenomenon, expanding into other genres, animation, and endless merchandise. Using Xevious as its inspiration, Konami added two unique gameplay elements that gave Twinbee its own flavor. First was the bell system, a new power-up mechanic that had you shooting them endlessly to alter their color, and properties as they slowly fall down the screen. Initially, the yellow bells just rack up your score, but shoot them enough and they'll change to white, blue, red, etc. Not just once, but a few times, then another few times, then like 10 or 20 times, to change from shot power, to speed up, to shield or options. And you'd have bells falling all over the screen. So playing Twinbee is like a juggling act, managing all these bells on the screen, shooting them just the right amount of times to get the colors you want, all while also dealing with enemies and bullets. Love it or hate it, it was very unique, and made the Twinbee series stand out from all the other shooters. The second edition was 2-player co-op, which seems pretty standard today, but a pretty rare deal in 1985, especially since Gradius the same year was a 1-player affair. You could even interact in various ways, like holding hands for a more powerful shot. So playing it co-op with a friend definitely made it come into its own. It's quite brutal and the antithesis of what you'd think a cute, kid-friendly game would be. If anything, it's a far more strategic and scoring-oriented game than Gradius. Difficult and addicting? Yes. For kids? Absolutely not. It's hard enough to where Konami lets you take some hits along the way instead of a one-hit death, losing limbs which stops you from being able to bomb. You also respawn at death versus the checkpoint system of Gradius, which sounds like it would make it easier, but not really, as you can easily end up overpowered and often overwhelmed by enemies. Despite its unique mechanics and technical gameplay, I never personally got into the original game, not nearly as much as Gradius. The levels weren't as diverse or interesting, so it became a repetitive technical exercise, so it just didn't capture my attention in the same way. That didn't stop it from being extremely popular, and the home port on Famicom was a big seller in Japan. Despite the visual downgrade, it was a solid port that played really well without any slowdown or much flicker, maintaining the fast and strategic gameplay of the arcade. It also saw ports on the MSX, Sharp 68000, and on many portable collections as well. I enjoyed the follow-up Twinbee games a whole lot more than the original, as they took the innovative mechanics and paired them with much more diverse, interesting levels and some great music. But again, for 1985, the innovative gameplay and scoring depth was really impressive, and even trumps Gradius in that regard. So despite its modest and repetitive presentation, Twinbee is a really well-designed game, even if overly difficult and complex for its own good, making it a B for me, but a solid start to what would become a major franchise for Konami. It'd be 6 years before Twinbee got a true arcade sequel and lifted the series to new heights, but not before it got an odd hybrid port on the Famicom and NES, taking a cue from Salamander and mixing horizontal with vertical levels. Stinger is a bit of an oddity as it doesn't work nearly as well here, mainly because the innovative bell system wasn't properly refined for the horizontal plane. Unlike the later Parodius games which had the bells float right to left, in Stinger, they still fall from the sky like on a vertical stage, making you shoot special upward hearts to keep them afloat. Between taking a ton of hits to change color, just juggling them horizontally this way is cumbersome. Yes, the graphics are improved over the first, along with weirder and more creative bosses, but it's marred by the horizontal levels that are quite long and still repetitive, and the bosses themselves are mostly a joke and die very easily, not nearly as challenging as the much more difficult stages. Now the vertical levels feel more appropriate and fit the game's mechanics far better. The music is also a bit more varied and changes as you power up, but still only a handful of tunes that repeat. And overall, while it's not a bad game for its time, feels unbalanced and the least interesting in the series. I get the impression Salamander did so well with its hybrid approach. Konami figured why not? Try it with Twinbee 2, but it doesn't work nearly as well here. It was originally a Famicom Disk System game before coming to cartridge, and believe it or not, the only Twinbee game to officially make it to the US during its initial run. Odd, considering how popular Twinbee became in Japan. I guess they figured us Yanks wouldn't appreciate a cute and quirky game series. It's decent, but a mid-tier game for me. Now that's what I'm talking about. Thankfully, Konami went back to the drawing board for yet another console release in '89, with Twinbee 3. And this game pops. They jettisoned the long and awkward horizontal levels found in Stinger, and instead focused on the core vertical gameplay. And it's all the better for it. The graphics, again, are nothing to get excited about. The bosses, however, are really well designed and creative. A huge step up from the previous games and a real highlight. There's only 5 stages and you choose your starting level, and the game difficulty is quite a bit easier, though the option is there to crank up the difficulty for a much bigger challenge. It's easier than ever to grab the bell color you want, as they often remain unchanged with a few hits before switching off again. And now, when losing your arms, the ambulance will keep showing up endlessly to recover them, making it more forgiving. To top it off, there's now a soul recovery system, where dying has a small version of you float up the screen. Grab it and recover your power-ups, again making it way more forgiving. It also plays fast without a hint of slowdown, which is always a plus. And the amount of speed-ups it gives you are copious. Too much so. Special mention to the music as well, which is some of the best of the Famicom games. And it never got a port into any collection, aside from the odd mobile phone port. But if I was going to replay any of the Famicom Twinbee games, it's Twinbee 3 that'd be my choice. It's a quick and fun, fast-paced blast, with really good music that can be run through in no time, and removes the aspects of Stinger that I didn't feel jived with the Twinbee formula. And setting it up to hard makes it both tough and fun to play. If you can get past the basic graphics and the flicker, this is an enjoyable game and one of my favorite Twinbee games, just making it into the A tier for me.
Destroy them all!
You'd think with the success of Gradius just 1 year later in '86, Konami would be punching out a sequel. Instead, they went with a completely experimental spin-off, Salamander. And I'm glad they did, as it turned out to be one of my top 3 Konami shooters of all time. I absolutely love Salamander. That includes the more grotesque variant Life Force. While Salamander removed the Gradius option system and simplified power-ups, Life Force in Japanese arcades brought it back, making it a super cool variant. In 1986, just a year after Gradius, Salamander was mind-blowing. The first shooting game to mix up horizontal and vertical levels, switching perspective back and forth, a much more creative aesthetic, and huge step up in level and boss design, with a theme and atmosphere to the game. Oh, and that music. As iconic as the Gradius soundtracks have become, it's Salamander that holds my personal top spot as the most incredible work Konami's ever produced for a shooting game. The opening stage theme is iconic, a sense of danger and edge as you fly through organic walls and teeth. Then the greatest boss music, Poison of Snake. Evil and foreboding, quite possibly my favorite boss music in a shooting game. Then turning on a dime as it switches to a vertical stage, suddenly upbeat and catchy. From start to finish, the music, aesthetics, and creativity of Salamander was next level. Only now you can play co-op with a friend? I'm in. But it was the altered NES port that many, including myself, played for the first time. Not Salamander, but Life Force, replacing some of the original stages with more organic and horror themes, not to mention some levels and bosses unique to the port. And while it's downgraded as expected, it's an even more excellent port than Gradius was, making it a nostalgic favorite. That's not to be confused with Life Force in Japan arcades, which again was an altered version of the original Salamander, but not the same as the NES port. Confused yet? If you really want a deep dive on the actual history of Gradius, Life Force, and the various differences, I recommend the fantastic History of Gradius video by my friend Crispy Crisps. It's a top-notch production that explains it and more, to fill in the historical blanks that I can't cover here. One thing you shouldn't be confused about was the best port of the original Salamander, which again was on PC Engine and nearly arcade perfect. Minus the voices, but again, plus on the soundtrack, with even better chiptune renditions of the already incredible music. Take a guess which version of Salamander I play most. Konami didn't mess around when it came to some great PC Engine ports. There was also the usual plethora of computer ports for such a popular game. On the Commodore 64, Amstrad, ZX Spectrum, and more, with the C64 port in particular, while greatly downgraded, still considered one of the best ports on the system. But of special note was the MSX port, which is quite different from the original, with longer levels, and the ability to actually choose your next 3 stages after clearing the first 2. It even has some unique weapon features like allowing your ships to merge in 2-player mode, and the enhanced port shown here is fantastic. The Saturn and PlayStation got a deluxe pack with both Salamander games, and the Japanese version of Life Force. But the easiest way to play them all today is via modern consoles, PS4, Switch, Xbox One, and even PC, via the Konami Anniversary Collection. Or you can opt for the excellent arcade archives on PS4 and Switch. It was popular in arcades and sold like gangbusters at home. While not revolutionary in gameplay, it's simply one of the legendary shooters, and one many of us have a huge nostalgia for. Every good version of this game, Salamander, Life Force, and any of its variants are an S+ experience, and one of Konami's greats. With the MSX computer incredibly popular in Japan, it comes as no surprise that Konami was prolific there, with over 70 games, many of them exclusive, and not just arcade ports. Of course, many of them were going to be shooters, and Nightmare is one of the most unique and well received. And trust me, it's a lot more fun to play than it is to look at. First and foremost is the music, which is another standout banger from 80s Konami. It perfectly suits the pace of the game, and almost makes the slow, choppy scrolling feel less obtrusive, as it matches the rhythm. If you enjoy good 8-bit chiptunes, Nightmare is worth playing for the music alone. Second, Nightmare is a serious challenge and is a lot harder than it looks. The screen may scroll slow, but the enemies start to flood that screen as early as the first level, and some, like these Blue Knights, take a good few hits to kill. You'll quickly find yourself weaving through enemy patterns or avoiding some altogether just to stay alive. The bosses are also pretty varied and unique. With a theme of Greek mythology, Konami knew the MSX, and did a good job offsetting the lethargic scroll pace with challenging enemy patterns. Nightmare also has a lot of power-ups to play with, not only upgrading to different shot types, but also a shield to block frontal damage, and timed item pickups like invincibility. If you can, opt to play the Gold Pack version, which makes a lot of technical improvements. Personally, Nightmare hasn't aged as well for me, as aside from the great music and challenging gameplay, the somewhat lethargic pace is less appealing in this day and age, but it's still a well-designed game, especially for 1986 MSX. No, it's not gonna light your world on fire, and the levels do get repetitive after a while, but the solid stage design, great music, and considerable challenge goes a long way to offset the slower pace and repetition, making it a B tier for someone like myself, who didn't get to grow up playing an MSX, but I do imagine for those that did, would likely rank it even higher. Maybe it's just me, but despite Hinotori not being nearly as known or popular as Nightmare on MSX, I found it way cooler and more engaging. Released just 1 year later in '87 on the MSX2, the upgraded hardware likely has a lot to do with it. It scrolls and plays much faster, and the music is still outstanding, which is a good thing as there's only one main song that plays through most of the game. But that's not the only reason, as there's more under the hood that makes it more engaging. First is that the levels aren't linear, but more like mazes that constantly loop. So instead of passively waiting for the screen to scroll upward, you're taking different paths, not simply for variety, but for actual exploration, as you need to find and acquire certain items to actually progress to the stage boss. Not that Nightmare didn't also loop and have warps and secrets to find, but Hinotori is far more maze-like and varied. Between a handy map, item selection and password saving. It's like an auto-scrolling shooting adventure game, and because it moves at such a faster pace, it's less of a grind to loop through some areas again, and you will loop through stages again, as you won't be able to open certain areas on the first run without the right items. So it's almost got an exploratory Metroid-like quality, where you return later to access previously closed areas. So you're back with a purpose and headed toward a new area. Phoenix statues hand out clues on how to proceed or find items, so playing the English translation is definitely a good idea if you don't know the Japanese alphabet. In addition to the usual weapon upgrades, there's also a jump mechanic for hopping over shots or platforms. Hinotori was based on a previous Famicom game, which was based on a popular manga, which wasn't a shooter at all, but both games never left Japan and remain pretty obscure. I personally feel Hinotori on MSX would have made a great Famicom game, and if you have big nostalgia for the 8-bit days like I do, it very much scratches that itch. Again, it's not gonna set the world on fire, and can still get repetitive, but it moves so much faster and has a lot more exploration than the more lethargically paced Nightmare, and I consider it a hidden 8-bit era gem, a B+ in the Konami library. If you love Konami shooters and Gradius, and never played Space Manbo, then consider it the best Konami shooter you've never played. Actually, consider it one of the best 8-bit era shooters ever made, really. It's got everything you'd expect from an early Konami shooter, as it released just after Gradius 2, when Konami was in their prime, releasing their best work. Great visuals and effects that surpassed most any other MSX game at the time, and pushed the computer past its limits. And as impressive as it was, with smoother scrolling and parallax backgrounds than most any other MSX game, it did hit its limitations with slowdown. But lucky for us, there's now a turbo hack that gets the game playing full speed and even smoother, which is what you're seeing here. And though it does make the game harder without slowdown, it's worth checking out as it's still very playable this way, or at least until you get blue-balled toward the end of the game. The soundtrack is also fantastic, and on par with some of their best work. Consistently catchy and memorable on nearly every level. While the gameplay does feel very much like Gradius, it differs quite a bit in terms of mechanics. Here, your Space Mambo, purposefully meant to look like a mambo fish, has a set of directional options. You can switch between forward, vertical, or rear firing, and will need to, as that's a key element of the gameplay. Your weapon is either a needle shot or a spread wave, and a missile pickup rounds out the arsenal. No power-up system like in Gradius. Instead, you have a very long power gauge that doesn't reset when you die, but it does slowly drain over time, forcing you to keep powering up as you play and not get complacent. Space Mambo really is all the good and all the bad that comes with Konami's early shooters. It's still very easy to die on walls and obstacles by accident, especially when there are so many tight spaces to squeeze through. And the checkpoint system here puts you way back after death. If you die on a boss, expect to get sent halfway back into the level and do it all again. A good thing in that it gives you plenty of time to speed up and power up again with options. So the Gradius syndrome is minimal, with every checkpoint being quite recoverable as long as you can keep your overall power level decent. But it's also a huge pain in the butt, dying in a particular hard boss to learn, then having to redo half the level over again. That's never more true than the pain in the ass Stage 7 boss, and its ricocheting blue balls of despair, which when played with the turbo hack, is kind of overwhelming, and it'll have you redoing most of the level over and over, just to get teabagged again. Thus the despair. Now I do think that some get a wee bit overzealous proclaiming Space Mambo to be the greatest 8-bit shooter of all time, or even the best from Konami. I still prefer some of their early Gradius games myself, and it's got those few early warts that make it less friendly to newcomers, like the spaced out checkpoints. But really, when was any early Gradius all that friendly to newcomers? But Space Mambo has all the ingredients that make Konami shooters great, and the fact it's even mentioned in the same breath as their other great games is reason enough to get intrigued and play it. From the outstanding graphics work and incredible music to the classic feel of the gameplay, it should be on any Konami fan's list to play. Konami was flexing on the NES, as Falcion was easily the most technically impressive game on the Famicom Disk System, and honestly hard to believe it could be done. In an era where even the 16-bit console struggled to replicate 3D rail shooters, Konami comes along and makes an 8-bit version that runs smooth, without slowdown and nearly flicker-free. It was actually designed for the rare 3D glasses made for that system, and I'd love to see what that looks like one day. But even in 2D, the game impresses. What's just as impressive is the music, some of Konami's best work. Every stage is a banger, and coupled with its impressive visuals, really helps elevate the game. And that's a good thing, as the game itself isn't bad, but also nothing memorable in terms of gameplay and mechanics. It really is a typical rail shooter without any gimmicks, aside from a set of limited missiles. You fly forward, you kill enemies and shots before they can reach you, and you avoid the rest. Kill the boss, rinse and repeat. Nothing wrong with that, as when done well, and coupled with memorable visuals and great music, you've got yourself a fun game. And that's exactly what Falcion is. A phenomenal tech demo and a fun game, but only truly memorable for the former. Part of that is the technical limitation. Despite how impressive it is, it's often really hard to judge depth quickly enough, and if you try to visually dodge bullets, you'll often end up dead. They move way too fast and appear too quickly to react. Add the fact that they're often obscured by your ship, and it makes for fun, but also some frustrating gameplay. So just keep moving, know the waves, and take advantage of the fact that bullets are aimed. So once they fire out, simply timing your movement will usually have you in a safe position. Falcion was never ported anywhere and remains an obscure curiosity, which is a shame, as it's really impressive. The music elevates it further, and it'll give you those 8-bit feels. C+ grade gameplay combined with S-tier 8-bit visuals and music makes Falcion a B+ for me. Ask most shooting fans what their most impressive Famicom game was, and they'll often say Rekka, but in terms of overall visual brilliance and creativity, I'd put my money on Konami's Crisis Force, one of the few games that could be mistaken for a 16-bit shooter, and actually looks better than some. Yes, this game has slowdown and flicker, as it pushes the hardware to its limits, but it's a small price to pay for these visuals. Right from the first stage, you have incoming lasers that blow up various parts of the city below, followed by the ground opening to expose parallax layers of Earth as enemies fly out from inside. I mean, how did Konami pull off faux parallax scrolling on the Famicom? This is freaking good stuff, and if it was cool when Compile did it with Musha on the Mega Drive, you can bet your ass it's cool when Konami pulled it off a year later on the 8-bit Famicom. Konami seemed pretty adamant about showing that it could pull off some of Musha's effects throughout parts of the game. All the stages are extremely varied, each with multiple backdrops and creative ways of transitioning from one to another. Same with the enemies, which are constantly changing into various sizes, rarely showing you the same type throughout the game. It's creative in a way that reminds me of Soldier Blade, where you're constantly experiencing something new throughout the level. The music and effects are typical Konami goodness, with plenty of standout tracks across the 7 stages. But Crisis Force is special because it backs up its killer presentation with gameplay to match, and is one of the best vertical shooters on the console. One of the coolest aspects is your ship transformation, letting you quickly switch between 3 different ships, each with their own shot types and bombs, almost like swapping between weapon loadouts on the fly, and possibly an homage to Terra Cresta and the Phoenix. Picking up enough orbs turns you into a large mecha bird for a set length of time, though you're not totally invincible and lose time for getting hit. You can tell Konami went all out and nothing was lazy. Even the boss rush at the end of the game is actually a set of unique bosses, and not just recycled from the earlier game. And to top it all off, somehow Konami managed to make it 2 players and still function. It's great for entry-level players, as it's one of the few Konami shooters made for consoles, and is balanced accordingly. Quite accessible. If you haven't guessed, yes, Crisis Force is one of the better shooters on the Famicom, and easily one of the most impressive. That makes it an S-tier game all the way and a must-play. Ajax is an odd bird and starts off kinda weird. The intro has a jet taking off from an aircraft carrier. Then the game begins and you're in a chopper? What happened there exactly? Now I'm curious where the jet comes into play. Ah, there it is. Stage 2, it switches to a 3D rail shooter and you're the jet. So yeah, an odd bird, but not a bad one. Just a game with a bit of an identity crisis. It turns out these 3D sections are really short and feel more like bonus levels, with the bulk of the game being a vertical shooter with the chopper. I'd describe it as Raiden mixed with Xevious, as it really has the look and feel of the former with the ground bombing of the latter. Except Ajax predates Raiden by 3 years, releasing the same year as Flying Shark by Toaplan. So for 1987, Ajax is pretty darn manic, and some solid graphics and meaty explosions for its time. Just having some jank here and there that kind of makes it unpredictable. Maybe it's just me, but the hit detection seems a bit off. Not just in the chopper sections, but for the 3D levels as well. The power-up system can be a nuisance, as they cycle through options really fast, making it hard to grab what you want in time. You pretty much have to hug the item and stay close, then sick grab it the moment it switches, and hope not to die in the process. There's more like this, but without getting into too much detail. It just feels like it may have been rushed and needed more time to bake. It was popular enough to get a handful of computer ports, with not surprisingly the Sharp 68000 being the most accurate, and changes things up a bit by giving you some control over the scrolling, and most recently released on Arcade Archives. It's absolutely worth checking out for the $8, as I personally feel it gets a bad rap for simply not being on par with the best of Konami. The visuals and sound are a bit beyond 87 standards, so it seems like a much newer game and is judged like one. It's a good bit more impressive and varied than Flying Shark the same year, and it really is fun to play when it's not reminding you that it needs some work. But let's be real, no, it's nowhere near the artistry of Flying Shark, which just flowed perfectly and was truly the progenitor for the Raiden series that followed, even if it shows its age. Ajax is more like a blockbuster that was fun to go watch, good eye candy and effects, but maybe a bit shallow and ultimately not memorable enough to stay with you the next day. When one of Konami's less successful arcade games is still in the B tier, it speaks volumes about how good a developer they actually were. Thundercross is like Gradius' brother from another mother, and you can feel it the moment you start the game. The popcorn enemies flying into the screen in a straight line is like the opening of any Gradius stage, but that couldn't be further from the truth, as despite the bits of familiarity that'll help any fan feel right at home, Thundercross does a ton to differentiate itself and feels like its own game. The most obvious are the visuals, almost purposefully opposite from anything Gradius, without a space background in sight, and it doesn't look bad for 1988, but also not particularly inspiring. Chunky and drab is probably how I describe it, sitting next to R-Type, which released the year prior. It comes off like the buck-toothed cousin your uncle invited to the party, so he could hit on his stepmom. But while it doesn't have too many standouts visually, the same can't be said for the stage design and gameplay, which seems like Konami did take a close look at R-Type. Not to copy it, no, it plays nothing like it, but to devise some creative stage hazards and layouts of their own, that sometimes feel as much like an Iron game as they do a Gradius. A possible early peek at Konami's ambition that'd later culminate in the phenomenal Zezix, which you'll see later in the video, though not as memo-heavy or punishing. In general, Thundercross isn't nearly as punishing as any Gradius game either, almost surprisingly fair and accessible for an arcade game. For starters, the Gradius syndrome is gone. There's far less areas where you can't quickly power up after a mistake. You can adjust your option position for various areas to more easily take out enemies. And finally, your weapons are pretty powerful, to the point where it's even easier to coast through some levels and bosses than in Gradius when fully powered. Oh, and avoid the US version of this game at all costs. To try and balance the game back toward a much harder difficulty, all of the awesome weapon options have been completely removed. You simply start with the basic Vulcan and a couple options, and that's the only weapon you get. To compensate, they give you 3 bombs, and call them Lil Baby. Lil Garbage is more like it. So please, avoid the US version like the plague. And that's because Thundercross, as it was intended, is excellent. It's one of the better arcade releases Konami made, and I haven't even mentioned the fantastic music yet, because of course it is. I also think I just realized where Thunder Force 4 got its boss music from. Thundercross was barely ported anywhere and faded into obscurity, only getting a compilation release on the PS2, until recently getting a modern release as part of the arcade archives. And to be fair, the visuals have their moments and are decent, but they won't blow you away. The music is everything you'd expect from Konami. And the gameplay is a successful departure from Gradius, while still feeling familiar, carving its own path, and actually improving upon numerous aspects that can make the mainline Gradius games pretty frustrating. Thundercross is an A-tier game that comes highly recommended. So you think you've played Gradius 2, but actually no, you've only played Gradius 2. Wait, what? Yes, the Gradius 2 arcade we all know and love, with emphasis on the Roman numeral 2, is not the same as Gradius 2, with emphasis on the number 2. Two completely different games. Yeah, thanks for that, Konami. Before the arcade version ever released, 1 year prior in 1987, Gradius Number 2, the sequel to the original MSX Gradius, was released. And not only is it a completely different game from arcade Gradius 2, it's a must-play for any Gradius fan, although I highly recommend you play it the best way possible, as the original MSX game, of course, suffered from its usual choppy scrolling. Fear not, as a hacked and sped up way to play the game exists for MSX fans, which is what you're seeing here. But an even better, definitive enhanced port was released for the much more powerful Sharp 68000 and renamed Nemesis 90 Kai. Beautiful in presentation with varied and unique levels, and a nice soundtrack. It's a damn shame that more haven't heard of it, as it actually introduced a lot of the series mainstays that you'd see in the games going forward, like the Ruins, a biological plant stage, and a fire level. The enhanced 90 Kai port also added new levels and bosses to the mix, making for quite a long game. This alternate lineage of Gradius games also introduced its own quirks and features. After each boss, you invade its core for a special level, and if you kill it fast enough, you're rewarded with a special weapon to use for the rest of the game, unique to the series, like this wide upward or downward laser, and they can all be upgraded like your regular weapons. There's also new enemy drops with different effects, like slowing down enemies, or an option ring that has them circling around you, just two of many that the designers came up with, along with some pretty metal names for the characters and enemies, because Konami were big-time Metallica fans. In fact, if you want a super in-depth look at the MSX games, my friend Shmup's BR did an entire dossier video, and though his channel is in Portuguese, it's all subtitled in English for your reading enjoyment. He is an absolute MSX and Sharp expert, and I can tell you that I've learned a ton from him on the subject. Finally, there was a much improved version of the MSX game released on PSP. Not on the level of 90 Kai, but a smooth scrolling, improved version of the original. Nemesis 90 Kai especially is one of the best Gradius games you've possibly never played. So if you haven't, and aren't afraid to emulate the Sharp 68000, you'll be rewarded with a classic Gradius experience on the level of the arcade games, only new and remixed. It's beautiful, it sounds great, and it plays as solid as any in the series. Just when you think the game is over, it forces you to start replaying the levels in reverse to complete the game. But before you roll your eyes, 90 Kai introduces a handful of brand new levels on the return trip, some of which are the coolest in the game, so you'll have to retrace some familiar territory for the reward of seeing it all. But as it stands, squarely an A-tier game for me. Both the MSX and 90 Kai versions are a must-play for any Gradius fan. Now will the real Gradius 2 please stand up? The Gradius 2 arcade that we all know and love, titled Gofer no Yabo, considered by many, including myself, to be the early peak of the series. One of the greatest Gradius games of all time, and my most played along with Salamander. Konami took everything that worked in the original game and created a masterpiece of the series. Opening with a bang to massive suns and flaming dragons, and another iconic soundtrack. Konami used their upgraded Twin 16 hardware to take it to the next level. The two Gradius 2 games introduced almost all of the series tropes and weapons going forward. The new weapon loadouts you can choose from the start. The Salamander-inspired speed stage, where you fly through the level at a breakneck pace, having to memorize the maze and layout. The end of game, indestructible Spider Walker. A boss rush that instead of having you fight the same ones all over again, hits the nostalgia button and has you fight them from the original Gradius and Salamander instead. Before culminating with a brand new boss that's one of the most fun in the series. And a set of completely unique stages, from aliens to ice crystals, to of course, Moai, who are meaner than ever and change colors to let you know they mean business. Gradius 2 meant business. Like hard. Really hard. A huge step up from the original game. And that's why, guess which version of Gradius 2 is my most played? That's right, baby. The phenomenal port on the PC Engine. Now on Super CD, Konami went to town and crafted my favorite Gradius game of all time. Graphics on par with the arcade original, CD music identical to the original, extra levels not found in the arcade, and you guessed it, a perfect difficulty curve that most players can actually enjoy, and likely how Konami originally wanted it, before having to make it so brutal for the arcades. The PC Engine Super CD port literally has it all. But it also got a fantastic port on the Famicom, really quite amazing for the old 8-bit console, by Konami using the VRC4, a custom memory mapper like they did for Castelvania 3. In fact, it's a port I highly recommend any fan play, as it's extremely unique like many of the other NES and Famicom ports. Differing levels, new music, some exclusive bosses, and an overall wonderful game. But if you're looking for arcade ports, it got a Sharp 68000 version, as well as deluxe packs on the Saturn and PlayStation, and on the PSP collection. The MSX got a very unique port dubbed Episode 2, or Nemesis 3 in the West, which actually wasn't a port at all, but a different game. Aside from the opening stage, everything else becomes completely different. Not just different stages and bosses, but gameplay more similar to the previous MSX game, only more so, where you're forced to hunt for weapons throughout the stage, scouring levels looking for map pieces, with a bunch of other helpful items to help you find them. So if you're looking for an RPG-like experience with your Gradius, you may be interested. It's not the best game in terms of mechanics and creativity, though it's very original, and I could totally see myself playing this as a kid on the MSX, and getting into the exploration. And if you want to know much more about the game, you can again find that in the Gradius MSX dossier by Shmup's BR. Gradius 2 Gofer is peak Konami when they were at their best, and in my opinion, it was so well done that they had a hard time beating it going forward. Sure, the technology and graphics improved, and new ideas and directions were explored. Gradius 2 is the game you think of as the peak of the original games, and an S+ of the lineup. I said it before in my every PC Engine shooter reviewed video, and I'll say it again. If you're a Gradius fan and you haven't played Gradius 2, I got news for you. You're not a Gradius fan. Now go play it.
Destroy them all!
And then there was Gradius 3, the most insane Gradius game. No, the most insane game period that Konami produced. No, possibly one of the most insane games ever made. And I mean that in the best and the worst possible way. Gradius 3 is good, really good. While it wasn't a huge leap visually from Gradius 2, I personally find it near equally creative, if not more so in its stage, enemy, and boss design. While the opening level can't compete with the Flaming Suns and Fire Dragons, everything forward is like a souped up Gradius 2 on steroids. From the famous Stage 2 bubble level and onward, Gradius 3 is as evil as it is cool. You'll still see the usual Volcano and Moai stages, but with so many new gameplay wrinkles and obstacles that it feels like a brand new level. Instead of just Moai attached to floating islands, you now have large heads spinning their way toward you, blocking your path, and giant towers of them that you blast through to break down the wall. But actually, I lied. You won't see them, unless it's on replay, because you'll probably never get there. Not even close. No, you're still stuck on stage 2 with the bubbles. Maybe the volcanoes on 3, if you're good. And that's because Gradius 3 is notorious and considered one of the hardest shooters ever made. And one look at this footage by the amazingly talented Refkey should be enough to confirm that claim. Stage after stage, Gradius 3 shows its creativity in the obstacles, like the late cube stage which forms dynamically as you progress. Such a fascinating idea for 1989. But then, it straight takes a dump in your pudding, with a segment so frustrating it'll have you slamming the joystick in anger, as you hide behind these stacking blocks, as they try to slam into you at warp speed, a completely undodgeable speed, as you cower underneath and hope to get lucky. Gradius 3 is chock full of incredibly cool and creative design ideas, on a level beyond Gradius 2 or anything that came before, but makes some of them so impenetrably impossible to overcome that it's hard to enjoy. The game is long at 10 stages, making an impossibly hard game that much harder. It even throws in an odd 3D level without enemies as an experiment, just because. And to top it off, you get no continues in an arcade game, so it's a 1cc or nothing. Oh, they throw you a bone with an easy mode, but that ends at level 3 and tells you to start over. Man up and get your ass kicked. You better be the Chuck Norris of experts if you plan to beat this game. And it's a shame, as Gradius 3 deserves to be experienced. That includes the exceptional music, some of the best in the series. Revising old favorites along with new classics of its own, the great compositions came even more into their own on the most well-known port of the game, on the Super Nintendo. The port was an early one, and took a lot of flack for the immense slowdown through a big portion of the game, even in some moments without too much on the screen. It overshadowed what was otherwise a wonderful rendition, without the brutal difficulty of the arcade. Some of the stages were missing and others reworked completely, but in some ways, it was the better game and it captured the spirit of the original. But I'll tell you what, a lot of the slowdown flack was unfounded, as for those who know the arcade original, know that it also had a ton of slowdown, especially when fully loaded with options and a lot on the screen, to the point where it's not as different from the SNES port as detractors would have you believe. And the enhanced soundtrack on the Nintendo was simply sublime. Lucky for us, just 2 years ago, Vitor Vieira created an SA1 hack that completely removed the slowdown, and if you want to see how kick-ass it is that way, I did a whole segment on it in my top 5 hardest shooters on the Super Nintendo. But suffice to say, even in original form, it's a nostalgic favorite for many and a gem of a game. Strangely enough, Gradius 3 didn't see many other ports, aside from the later Gradius pack on the PS2, as well as on Saturn and a collection on the PSP, both of which let you turn off the slowdown if desired, though it honestly makes the arcade original nigh impossible, and you can now pick it up on arcade archives as well. Many will say Gradius 3 was a bit of a letdown, not because it was bad, but because it didn't differentiate itself enough from the amazing Part 2. And in some ways, I happen to disagree. Sure, it may look similar without a huge jump in graphics like it was from the first, but it's the stage layouts, obstacles and hazards, and the extensive gymnastics needed to navigate them that's taken to another level. Stages are so packed with difficult gauntlets to overcome that you can't help but marvel at how much effort was put into making each one so dense and original. Its biggest flaw is turning all of these great ideas into frustration by jumping the shark in difficulty into a level of absurdity. A game this hell-bent on being impossible can't be an S tier. It's a game that's hard to enjoy, and I can't say that I'm a huge fan of playing so much of the game in slow motion, bringing it down a grade as an A- for me, despite the top-tier presentation and design. Though I will admit, the Super Nintendo port running the SA1 hack at full speed is quite that S-tier experience and one of my favorites. But even at full speed, it doesn't begin to come close to the brutality of the arcade. Oh, and don't forget to try entering the Konami code on the SNES port for a little surprise. You can thank me later. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is a good way to describe Thundercross 2, so if you really enjoyed the first, you'll find plenty to like here, while it still retains that chunky and somewhat low-res look of the first. Konami took advantage with improved scaling effects and background layers on nearly every level. The animation of both enemies and bosses is much improved, while the stages have a lot more visual creativity. Some stages have verticality and changes of direction, like entering a battle cruiser to take it out from inside. I still wouldn't call Thundercross 2 a looker, but it's less to do with the stage designs, which are excellent, and more just the washed out, somewhat blurry look compared to its contemporaries. The same can't be said for the music, which is a noticeable difference from the first. The original composition sounded like Gradius remixes, as great as they were, while Part 2 is more rockin' and metal, with Konami going for a Thunder Force vibe. No doubt, some of these songs would be right at home in a techno-soft shooter. The weapon system makes a return, slightly rebalanced and with some new updates, along with beefed up super weapons. The flamethrowers are now flaming phoenixes, and it's as badass as it sounds. The gameplay still feels as much like a cross between Salamander and Gradius as ever, with the simplified weapon system and familiar enemy patterns and bullets. And it still has respawns at death while giving you plenty of power-ups to recover, in most cases. And it's different enough, both visually, musically, and mechanically, not to come off as a simple clone. So a minor evolution from the first game, and still just as good. It never saw a home release until the recent arcade archives, and is one of the mainline spin-offs that ended up nearly as good as the games it copies, while being less brutal and accessible to most. Thundercross 2, both games really, are very much worth your time. Trigun released in 1990, almost the same time as Raiden, just a month apart, so it's not fair to call it a clone. If anything, both are natural evolutions of Toaplan's formula, set years ago with Flying Shark and Q-Tiger. The big difference is that Raiden went on to become a smash hit, while Trigun, or Lightning Fighters, didn't make much of an impact at all and faded into obscurity. So the question is why? The graphics and stages are quite varied, more interesting than Raiden in general, with more motion in the backgrounds and even scaling effects for various ships. Raiden's visuals come across a bit bland by comparison. Check out this Stage 2 waterfall. No stage in Raiden looks this good. The bombs are flashy, like the beam sword and the flame dragon that flies around the screen. The explosions are exaggerated and meaty, with the bosses especially going down in a screen-flashing blaze of glory. While the music isn't the classic Raiden tune that we can't get enough of to this day, some of the tracks will definitely give you that Contra vibe and have you jamming as you tear your way through the enemy waves. Trigun does a heck of a lot right. One of my favorite aspects of the game is managing the bombs, as it gives you a ton of them, and they're meant to be used strategically in some areas that Konami intended, even specifically in some cases of one versus the other. They stack as you pick them up and get used in the same order, and that's because Trigun, much like Raiden, becomes brutally hard. And the best way to play for survival is only power your weapon up once, which does plenty of damage and keeps the rank from getting out of control, and save your bomb drops for the hardest moments, that are much easier to bomb through than to risk checkpoint hell. Some later checkpoints in the game are near impossible if you die, pretty much ending your run. Now the Lightning Fighters version replaces checkpoints with respawns, alleviating those handful of checkpoints from hell. But it also removes a really cool homing weapon that you grab on stage 3, to somewhat offset that loss in difficulty. Trigun is a game that'll kick the ass of almost anyone that plays it. You can make it a bit easier by playing co-op, which adds a really cool mechanic of sharing super weapons that both players control as a team. But toward the end game, it gets gnarly. Far as I can tell, there is no good reason I can think of that Trigun wasn't more popular, because if you love a souped-up, Toaplan-style game, it absolutely delivers. Any knock that I can make against it, like it being brutally hard, having some nearly impossible checkpoints, tough rank, and some gotcha moments, are all things that one can say about Raiden as well, and none of it changes how much fun it is to play. Is it a better or equal game to the original Raiden? No, I wouldn't say that. Raiden had a certain it factor that's hard to pin down, but you know it when you play it. Just like Konami's own Thundercross isn't quite Gradius, Trigun isn't quite Raiden. But you know what? It's pretty darn close, and in some aspects, a cut above. A game you'll both love and hate, but keep coming back for the fun factor. A brutal yet excellent Toaplan homage that should be played by every fan. ZZX is one of the best shooters Konami's ever made. How's that for an intro? No second-rate, non-mainline game shenanigans here. It may have been a one-off, but damn if it isn't spectacular. As it should be, made by the same team that developed Gradius 2 Gofer. Only instead of being locked down to the Gradius formula, Konami got to experiment and came up with an Irem hybrid that combined their own Gradius mechanics with Irem's X Multiply, an odd combo of force pod and tentacle mechanics. Because we all know Japan does love their tentacles. ZZX is still one of the most visually striking shooters Konami ever made, with bold, colorful graphics and impressive effects. For 1991, this was impressive, and no home ports at the time could even come close to replicating it. From the opening stage with the scrolling green sky, to the beautiful pink backdrop and cascading waterfalls of stage 3. It's like a mix of Salamander and the later Parodius games, with its vibrant aesthetic. Every stage has its own unique look and cool effects it pulls off, making their Gradius series seem pedestrian by comparison. Not only is it interesting visually, but the music is also classic Konami. Then you have the gameplay, where Konami clearly rips off the force pod mechanic mixed with a tentacle from X Multiply. Your pod protects you from incoming shots, and can be launched as a tentacle to either damage enemies or protect you from incoming fire. But losing your charge shot while it's away, when attached, you have a powerful tentacle attack, and using the tentacle strategically and defensively is what you'll need to survive. As typical arcade Konami and Irem, it's one tough game. There's also a lot of weapon variety throughout, with some standouts like the cool spiral beam, or the shadow laser that follows you as you move up and down the screen. But don't let the initial impression of being an Irem clone fool you, as after the first few stages, the gameplay speeds up quite a bit, with plenty of bullets flying your direction and it becoming a pretty Twitch-oriented game. If anything, ZZX may look like Irem, but it plays much like Gradius, only with the added mechanics of the force pod and tentacle. It works out to be an awesome mashup and makes the game incredibly fun. I also need to mention the nerfed international release. Don't play that one. While adding a 2-player mode, which is cool of course, it completely removes most of the weapon upgrades you can get, leaving you with basic power-ups only. Instead of a checkpoint system, it gives you respawns, and instead of lives, you get an energy bar. But to compensate, they increased the number and speed of bullets, even more, to some ridiculous levels. On top of that, the tentacle doesn't work the same and can only be launched instead of just detached in place, completely borking a lot of the strategic sections, where you needed to do that to properly survive. It's not thought through, and I highly recommend sticking with the original. What else can I say that isn't already up on screen here? ZZX is a masterpiece. Why wasn't it a hit if it was so good? It may have come out around the same time as a little game called Street Fighter II, which literally took everyone's attention, so it didn't do nearly as well as expected and was criminally overlooked. It did get one obscure port on the Salamander PSP collection, and most recently an Arcade Archives release, which is just awesome, because ZZX is awesome. It should be at or near the top of your list as an S-tier game.
Konami!
With the Gradius series exploding and Konami so prolific in arcades and home consoles during the late 80s, many of some of their best games released on MSX went unnoticed, especially outside of Japan or Europe. Like, did you know that the famous Parodius series started on the MSX before it ever hit arcades? And it was really good, even getting an enhanced PSP port that's a joy to play, and you're seeing here. Basically Gradius, with a mix of the Twinbee bell system, only much more colorful and creative, and stuffed to the brim with Japanese folklore and comedy. The very first game, The Octopus Saves the Earth, came out the same year as Gradius 3 in 1989, not only starring Taco the Octopus, but a full lineup of Konami characters, like Pentaro from Penguin Adventure and Papillon from Nightmare. And Parodius was a long time coming. Kind of a side project for the team while they worked on other games. In fact, the older MSX Gradius games had Easter eggs included, where if you inserted the right cartridge into the second slot, like Penguin Adventure or Twinbee, you could actually play as those characters in-game. And Parodius couldn't be cooler. Gradius enemies replaced with all sorts of animals and critters, but especially penguins. Lots of penguins. Parodius is manic, like you're flying through some demented psychedelic circus, and it would only get much more so as the series progressed. But even this original holds its own with the mainline games. Another standout was the music, which according to interviews, worked out to be a stroke of luck. Because they were rushed and didn't have time to compose new music, they grabbed classical tunes instead and gave them a remixed 8-bit treatment. And boy did it work out. These tunes are classic for a reason, and these peppy versions of Swan Lake or Flight of the Bumblebee will have you humming the rest of the day, not to mention suiting the game perfectly. Many of the series tropes started here, and were later reused in the much upgraded first arcade release. But the original Parodius is still a wonderful game in its own right, whether played for nostalgia on the MSX, or the full-speed enhanced port on PSP. This is an A-tier game, as good or better than any MSX Gradius that came before, and with a solid difficulty to match. I'll just come out and say it, Parodius is quite possibly better than Gradius. Blasphemy! We all love Parodius, but come on. No, I mean it. I couldn't believe how much more fun I was having with it. Because let's face it, aside from some altered mechanics, Parodius is Gradius. Only Konami let loose to be as creative as possible. You have more ship characters to choose from, each with their own weapon types. The levels are way more creative and colorful, with so much animation and enemy variety. The bosses are some of the most fun and memorable of any horizontal shooter ever made. The music is so damn catchy, it'll get stuck in your head for days afterward. And the gameplay and enemy patterns can be as challenging, nuanced, and well designed as the mainline games. It really is a manic Gradius on crack, with all the pros and cons that come along with it. Maybe not as brutal as arcade Gradius, which is also a good thing. So yes, if you ever ignored the Parodius series, dismissing it as a lesser than cute 'em up of Gradius, you're missing out. Arriving in 1990 on Konami's TMNT2 based hardware, the jump in graphics and color was astonishing. Compared to the more muted Gradius series, Parodius Arcade was a feast for the eyes. Flying Kitty Battleship, Clownheads replacing Moai, and the now infamous Vegas Dancer replacing the Spider Walker as you fly beneath her crotch, appreciating the view. The visuals blow away anything that came before. You can tell that it's the game Konami's designers wanted to make, without the restraint of Gradius lore, allowing them to add humor and random Japanese folklore to the designs. Heck, you'll even get a pachinko-themed stage with bumpers to fly through, possibly a sign of things to come. This original Parodius was by far Konami's most popular, coming at just the right time, so it was ported to a lot of different consoles, and the absolute best of them was on the Super Famicom, which looks nearly identical to the arcade. The music is converted phenomenally, and you get an extra bathhouse level that's exclusive to the port. Konami also had a better handle on the hardware by now, so the slowdown isn't nearly as bad as in Gradius 3, and very rarely interfering with the gameplay. It's the Nintendo port that I prefer to play. The PC Engine also got a great port of the game, though limited to a Hue card and not on CD, so compromises had to be made. Now it does play faster than on Super Famicom, but it's not quite on the level in terms of visuals or sound. It's also missing some stages due to memory limits on the card. Still a fantastic Konami quality port. The NES port was of course downgraded, but in typical Konami fashion, still impressive for the console and a great port. It also had an exclusive carnival level unique to the port, so even when the overall game had to cut corners and get compromised, Konami still found a way to make it unique to the platform and worth checking out. Parodius even saw release on Game Boy and the Sharp 68000. As well as the usual Arcade Perfect, PlayStation and Saturn compilations with their own bits of extras. But by far the most convenient is the big PSP collection, which included all the main Parodius games in one place. The original Parodius DA was really something special, and still holds up as one of the best horizontal shooters Konami ever produced. And while they kept upping the ante in graphics and creativity with the sequels you'll see next, DA still remains one of my all-time nostalgic favorites. Without a doubt, one of Konami's best, and a must-play S-tier game. It had been nearly 4 years since we saw another Parodius since DA, but it was well worth the wait, as Konami had ample time to build up another mountain of inspiration from other games and ideas to draw from. Gokujo Parodius, or Fantastic Journey, feels like the Parodius we know and love, only amped up with new hardware and a bunch of new characters along for the ride. Along with 2-player co-op. And just like the first game, each character has elements from other Konami shooters. The levels are just as creative, wacky, and colorful as the first game, with a ton of detail happening in the background and so many cute animations. At least if you're watching and not playing the game, as sometimes it's manic to the point of distraction. The bosses are even more so, with some of the most memorable moments of the series. Like the Dancing Panda and the Mermaid, the bell system and other mechanics return, along with the rank system Parodius is known for. In fact, if you're big into scoring and don't mind the serious difficulty curve, it'll give you an endless amount of replay value, as managing both the rank and scoring in this game is absolutely no joke. But for blokes like me that mainly enjoy playing through it for survival with various characters, the rank system alone is enough to keep you challenged. And the equally fantastic music, again with remixes of classics, that'll have you both smiling and humming the tunes long after. The space level is a crazy remix of Mary Had a Little Lamb, Yankee Doodle, London Bridge, and God knows what else. It's just all over the place, and Konami's musicians have a grand old time with it. Not quite as long as the first, with 7 stages, but it does add a bonus level and an end of credits stage, where you play to a bunch of classic Konami music. Before battling Pentaro X, Mecha Penguin, Gokuju had a solid port on the Super Famicom, and though it's not as hands down arcade perfect and amazing like Da was, it's still a great way to play. It's missing the 2-player mode completely, and there's more slowdown than the previous Da, which makes sense given how much more demanding the game is to run. But it does add even more cool Konami characters to the roster, like Goemon from Mystical Ninja and Kid Dracula. Of course, you can play it closer to arcade perfect on the deluxe pack releases or on the PSP. If you couldn't tell, I'm a big fan of this one too, and like I said before, in many ways, the Parodius games can sometimes be even better than Gradius. Not because they're cute, but the amount of love and detail squeezed into every nook and cranny of the game makes it so much fun to experience, if you can put up with the psychedelic overload. The second Parodius is as good as the first, and another S-tier game for Konami. One year later, instead of hitting arcades, Konami gave the Super Famicom an exclusive Parodius, and it talked way too much. Yep, Jikyo Oshibari, or Chatty Parodius, just won't shut up while you play the game.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
Okay, it actually translates to Talk Show Live, and live commentary is what you get. Apparently, they thought it was an amazing idea because they went out of their way to release a cartridge with a built-in chipset to allow for all the voice work. So imagine a Parodius where the peanut gallery is constantly commenting on your gameplay and won't shut up. I don't dislike Oshibari at all. It's still got what makes a Parodius game fun, with an even more insanely large roster of characters to choose from. It also changes things up a bit in design, with each stage a bit more focused around certain themes, and making fun of all sorts of Konami games, with homages to Tokimeki Memorial, Lethal Enforcers, and some of their newer shooters like Zezex, only stuffed with food. The high school stage has a poor penguin getting hazed, and beat down by the cool birds and their slick dude. Moai schoolgirls, and even penguin couples enjoying some alone time. Except for the lone pervert sitting and watching. Wait, what the hell is he doing? Oh! Damn it, Konami. I thought this was a family game. You even have a beautiful Twinbee stage, with a huge double D-boss that, okay, maybe it's not a family game. Konami didn't cut any corners just because it was console exclusive, and if anything, packed it full of extras that you wouldn't normally see in arcades. And it's as deep and difficult to master and play for score, and not just a dumbed down console exclusive. The biggest downside is all the graphical detail really taxes the console, and results in a lot of slowdown. Far more than in the original dock. However, that mostly gets remedied on the later ports to the Saturn and PlayStation. There's a lot of extra details and changes packed into the levels, like seeing the actual Justifier guns firing in the Lethal Enforcers level. If you're a huge fan of Parodius, I'd honestly say it's worth playing both, as though the 32-bit ports are improved. The Super Famicom also has a good bit of exclusive bosses, and variations in the game worth experiencing that were changed later on, even if it does play with more slowdown. Remove the super annoying announcer, and Oshibari is right up there with the other Parodius games. It's different, but not any less masterful in terms of creativity, design, or the sound, which is again a highlight. So thank God that Konami was smart enough to add the option to turn off the voice. No longer marred by the constantly distracting announcer, you can groove to the catchy music, get in a zone, and really enjoy the oral experience. Not that experience. I wouldn't say it's my favorite of the Parodius games, but that's kind of like saying it's your least favorite chocolate in the box. They all have their own flavor and are masterful works of code, with again, Osha Berry being no exception. As if the schoolgirls, Double D bosses, and perverted penguins in Osha Berry weren't enough to draw the Japanese boys to the yard, Konami doubled down on the titillation for the next and final arcade ROM. Sexy Parodius. The speed stage becomes a bathhouse, with penguins ogling, ladies bathing as you fly past, and a couple getting it on in their bathtub. It all happens fast, so they figure you won't notice. I noticed. Oh, and Catherine here's clearly been working out, and nothing says sexy like giant Tanuki nutsack. Fresh girl, good selection, moderate price. Oh my, I was almost expecting the titty twister on this level, but I should have known better and got pachinko instead. Though if you're looking for a cat house where you end up leaving with crabs, it's got you covered. In all seriousness though, this is why I love the Parodius series and wish more shooters, even the serious ones, displayed this kind of creativity in background and level design. And here it all works into the story, as you no longer can play as the original hero, Taco the Octopus. Turns out he's been corrupted by his success, or something like that, and is greedily hoarding his money while exploiting all these ladies and penguins with forced labor to carry out his dirty deeds. Like in this brothel stage, which eventually becomes a warehouse, where the ladies are being boxed and sent out, thanking you as you explode their crates and free them. A pretty damn dark trafficking motif, if you think about it, but I digress. This final Parodius is more than just sexy, but considered by some to be the best in the series. The visuals are the peak of the series, as creative and varied as ever, now with branching paths for a total of 9 levels, triggered by collecting items that determines which path you'll end up taking. What's great is despite the story and sexy motif, Konami doesn't just limit themselves, and just throws out anything they thought was a cool idea, like the awesome Castelvania level if it were built by mice. With Medusa as the stage boss. Which of course, has to moan and make an O face for some reason when she takes damage. The music is as awesome as ever and possibly my second favorite after the original classic remixes of Da. Another great aspect of Sexy, and why so many call it a favorite, is how customizable it is for various skill levels, especially the auto mode, which powers up for you instead of you using the options bar, beefs up your firepower, and respawns you at death instead of using the checkpoint system, making it much more accessible. Not to mention that dying now has you cough up your bell power-ups, which you can reacquire instead of starting over with a pea shooter. But for those steeped in Parodius scoring and lore, the semi and manual modes, plus the difficulty levels, is all you'll need to keep you plenty busy and gives you the traditional experience. The character roster is shaken up again with some new replacements, now that Taco and Pentaru are scheming as the villains. Sexy didn't make it to the Super Famicom, being a mid-90s release, and hit the 32-bit consoles instead, both Saturn and PlayStation, as well as the PSP. No matter how you choose to play it, it's one of the finest and funniest of the series, and a fantastic send-off to an amazing series that honestly deserved worldwide release on the same level as Gradius. Detana Twinbee is clear proof that Konami gave Nintendo a run for their money as the premier company that liked to torture children during the 80s and 90s by luring them with candy-coated dreams before hog-tying and throwing them into their white van. Of course, the love it or hate it bell mechanic is back in full force. If you're not into juggling bells for power-ups while taking on enemies at the same time, and all the timing and strategy involved, then Datana's not for you, as you won't be getting very far. Actually, you won't be getting very far anyway. Datana is like a rainbow-colored bowl of sugary Fruit Loops calling your name, only to be filled with razor blades below the surface of the milk. And that's just the first loop, with the second being literally one of the hardest things ever made. No extends, a large hitbox, let alone the bell system, which requires practice and finesse to properly exploit. So a beautiful exterior, hiding sadism at its finest. Hard to believe it was 6 long years between the original Twinbee in '85 and this sequel in '91 that truly brought the series into its own. Yes, after all that hyperbole, Datana is still the Twinbee that put the series on the map, and a huge step up from the original. Released as bells and whistles in Europe and the West, it's really the game most think of when they hear Twinbee, and it was the beautiful presentation and catchy tunes that made the game. Working for Konami, famous artist Shujiro Hamakawa designed the characters for both Twinbee and Parodius, with Twinbee becoming a pop culture phenomenon. The levels themselves look like they're taken out of a Miyazaki anime, with gorgeous pastel colors and castle-in-the-sky-like designs, while the story and cutscenes look more like a Toriyama Dragon Ball anime. To be fair, Konami wasn't the first, nor the last, to copy and take inspiration from either. They're just possibly the first to hide a torture session within all the cute and kitty visuals and music. Luckily, my first exposure to the game was on the PC Engine HuCard, which, while downgraded in graphics and missing details and a stage, still plays outstanding, far more accessible and fun to play unless you're an expert. This PC Engine port was even later released on the Wii Virtual Console and various PlayStation networks. And if you can't seem to make any headway with the brutal arcade version, I can't recommend the PC Engine port enough. If you were looking for a more arcade-accurate experience at home, you'd have to play it on the Sharp 68,000, at least until later, when it released as part of the deluxe packs on Saturn and PlayStation, though neither had a Tati option since, turning CRTs on their side wasn't quite a thing back then, though the PSP collection does let you play that way. So Datana is kind of like Gradius 3, a very good and deep game, if you can actually get anywhere in it, and if the bells don't piss you off to no end in an already brutal game. The second loop is considered one of the hardest accomplishments in all of shooting, and I want to congratulate our friend from Korea, Refkey, who pulled it off not long ago in amazing fashion with a 1 life clear. And if you want to check that out after the video, I've put a link in my description to his 2-loop 1cc. For most of us, playing Datana means playing on easier modes, via home ports, or using emulation. It's the seminal Twinbee game, but more for its aesthetics and uniqueness than its unforgiving gameplay. Still an excellent game, don't get me wrong, but insurmountable for most, beyond the first handful of easier levels, making it an A- for me, but a very important start to a series of games that had eventually become far more accessible and fun, and if played on the PC Engine, becomes an even A tier and something I can really enjoy. And that promised fun started just a couple years later with one of the best and easily most playable and accessible in the series. It was poppin'. Twinbee was always a perfect fit for this console's color capabilities, and it turned out as gorgeous as you'd expect. Some of the best and most colorful, detailed pixel art on the system, and that's saying something. To go along with it, of course, is another great Konami soundtrack that perfectly fits the game. But what really stands out is how much fun it can be for literally anyone that picks it up, as Konami clearly decided to make this more kid and console friendly, likely converting an entire new legion of fans. Instead of losing body parts or one-hit kills, you get a single life and an energy bar. If you die, you restart the level, but that energy is plenty to learn and master the levels. You also get several continues to keep practicing those levels as you progress. But the biggest change of all that makes it much less frustrating is the easier bell juggling, as now each color takes a few more hits before changing, so you're not constantly hitting them one too many times and screwing up the color you wanted to grab. It all comes together to make an overly easy game by comparison. But if I had to choose between that or the brutal Datana, I'll go with Poppin', because if you want a challenge, crank up that difficulty and watch it get quite hard. Another great aspect is the excellent co-op, which Konami pulls off on the Super Famicom with nearly no slowdown, not something too many games on the system can claim. And they've thrown in some extra mechanics this time, like throwing each other at enemies or around the screen, as well as being able to help each other by giving them your energy. Not many shooters have a great co-op mode where you really feel like you're playing together, but Poppin' is one of them. There's also a new punch mechanic for bigger damage, adding an element of aggressive play to a game already busy with mechanics. Your weapons are more powerful and satisfying to use, along with better screen coverage, again making it easier to keep the screen clear while juggling bells. Now it does have its flaws, mainly levels that can drag a bit too long, with the game taking nearly an hour to complete, and it feels like it, which is fine for a console game, but the slower scrolling pace makes repeated plays, once you've mastered the game, more of a chore. But overall, Poppin' is one of the best and most playable Twinbee games, and a shame that it never released in the US, because apparently, again, Konami didn't think us Yanks would take to a cutesy shooter. No, it's not on the level of the console's best, like Konami's own Axelay, which you'll see soon in the video, and I never got on with the bell mechanic myself, aside from the simplified Parodius method, and I suspect that it's the same for many. But it is one of the better on the system, and an easy A as one of the best in the franchise. Developed by the team that worked on Gokuju Parodius, Yahoo was the final arcade, and for many, the finest Twinbee game of the series. While it plays much more like the original Datana arcade, and faster paced to boot, which I love, it's also not as impossibly unforgiving, while remaining plenty arcade hard. None of the Twinbee games feel as much like you're playing through an anime as Yahoo, with each individual stage going through multiple locales and changes in scenery, while throwing out all sorts of cool scaling and scrolling effects. You can tell the game was designed by a Parodius team, as the bosses are now extremely memorable and creative on a level that previous games didn't quite match. Just the first stage alone will have you ogling at how good this game looks and sounds, and it only gets better from there. It doesn't always follow a set Twinbee theme either, like this crazy Alice in Wonderland level full of Cheshire cats and cards, before battling with Tweedledee and Tweedledum. It really does feel like it's mixed with Parodius in design, with far less grounded and more whimsical levels full of imagination. And dude, this battle with Mecha Alice Doll is all sorts of badass and Exorcist creepy. One of the most memorable boss fights in any shooting game, period. Gameplay-wise, besides being hard as hell again, but at least fair compared to Datana, you now get to choose your loadout across 4 different charge beams, from the usual forward power shot to a long-range power punch and a homing ground bomb. And many of those ground enemies contain a new set of secondary power-ups. You can carry up to 2 at a time, flamethrowers, bombs, a bazooka, you name it. Very useful when trying to quickly recover after death for some quick extra firepower, versus grabbing and changing enough bells to power up your main shot. The trade-off though is if your hands are holding the weapons, you can't use your ground bombs. There's a practice mode which is only the first 3 stages, and a special mode for the masochists, which is even harder than normal, like a second loop, but it's cool to have the option right up front. Yahoo got a deluxe pack port on both Saturn and PlayStation, almost right after its arcade release, and while it did get a PSP port too, it's missing the 2-player mode. For me personally, I love faster paced shooters, thus making Yahoo my personal favorite of the bunch. Do I love the Twinbee series as much as Gradius and Parodius? No, I don't. But despite my preference, it's a great and unique series. My guess is top-level players will always prefer Daytona, and I can see why, while casual and console-oriented will favor Poppin'. Yahoo would be it for me. It's fast-paced and frantic, amazing both visually and orally, hard enough to keep me coming back, and throws me just enough bones to feel like I can get through it one day on a credit without ripping my hair out. Before Twinbee became a side-scroller and an RPG, Yahoo was a phenomenal goodbye to the shooting side of the series. Konami gave the Super Nintendo a lot of love with some of its best exclusives, and in terms of shooters, that game was Axelay. Not only the best on the console along with Compile's Super Alesta, but easily one of the better of the generation. Taking a cue from Salamander that switches between vertical and horizontal levels. Only this time, Konami took advantage of its Mode 7 capability to create isometric vertical levels. The pseudo 3D effect is cool and made Axelay stand out in screenshots. And seeing it in motion back in '92 didn't disappoint, with tremendous use of various effects that were really only possible on the Super Nintendo at the time. But it wasn't just the Mode 7 gimmick that made Axelay stand out, as the art design in general was excellent. The boss designs were especially memorable, taking up huge portions of the screen and looking like multi-segmented monstrosities. The Beast of the Fire level, slowly emerging from the lava, was one of the most memorable boss encounters of the generation, coupled with another phenomenal soundtrack by Konami. Axelay was a system exclusive that made shooter fans of other consoles envious. Axelay was also an experiment in a new style of gameplay, and a complete departure from their other series. The most obvious is the weapon system, very unique from traditional shooters. The game has no power-ups, instead having you choose a loadout of 3 weapon types at the start of each level. And as the game progresses, more new weapons become available. All 3 weapons can be cycled through dynamically as you play, quickly changing them up for the situation, similar to Thunder Force. And getting hit will destroy your current weapon. Losing all 3 and getting hit results in death. However, colliding with enemies, walls, or obstacles is insta-death, so it's much more important to avoid those mistakes and take a bullet shot when necessary. Respawning after death brings all your weapons back, eliminating any kind of checkpoint hell or recovery that Konami was so well known for, and a complete 180 from their usual designs, making Axelay a very accessible, console-friendly game that garnered a huge following, just hard enough to present a good challenge to most players, and a solid hard mode for the more experienced, who've already cleared the game and learned which weapon loadouts were best for each level. There's a lot to say about Axelay, but the bottom line is it's a near definition of a classic, old-school shooter in almost every way, including a fair bit of slowdown here and there, but just enough to make the game more manageable, and rarely enough to take much away from the fun factor. The pixel art and graphics are gorgeous. The music is one of the best soundtracks on the SNES. The worst thing about Axelay is that there was never an Axelay 2, because some games simply stand the test of time and remain awesome as you play them over the decades. And Axelay is that game. S tier all the way, and a masterpiece from Konami. Salamander 2 can't get no love. After a decade of waiting for a sequel to one of my top 3 Konami shooters, it finally happened. And became a victim of its own success. The original Salamander was so beloved by fans that no matter how good, the sequel was gonna get picked apart. And while I do admit it doesn't surpass the first for me, nostalgia alone ensured that. Salamander 2 is really good. You can tell Konami worked their ass off to do the series justice. Nothing is lazy or generic. The vertical space levels are just as awesome, with the second stage coming off as an homage to the flaming suns in Gradius 2, solar flares and all, visually striking and a blast to play. But the graphics are also one of its criticisms. Compared to games like Polestar, R-Type Leo, and Konami's own Zezix, all games that released prior, it just doesn't measure up. The creativity and horsepower is there, but it almost feels like they struggled at times to put it all together. That doesn't mean it doesn't do a lot right, with some really neat 3D-like effects on asteroids and creatures. The art design is great, just a bit rough in places. You can't say the same for the standout soundtrack. There was no way that it could live up to the god-tier music of the original Salamander, but damn if it doesn't try and is full of bangers on nearly every stage. As a reward for completing the game, the second loop actually replaces some of the stage music with remixes from the first game. How cool is that? Makes me want to get good enough to actually complete the second loop, which I'm not. The gameplay is classic Salamander, with a handful of new mechanics thrown in. First, the option system, which now has 2 levels. The first pickup rotates around your ship like a shield, while the second makes it behave more traditionally. But the coolest addition is they can now be used offensively, with the fully powered options launching out like homing missiles to destroy enemies. Once used, they float around like the smaller option seed, ready to be collected again. Add the fact that dying lets you pick it back up again, making recovery more manageable. Your weapons now have multiple power levels, but only temporary, before reverting back to normal until you pick up another. And while the game is plenty arcade hard and a serious challenge down the stretch, it starts out fair enough to get the hang of things, and is definitely not as brutal as arcade Gradius 2, let alone the insane Gradius 3. The only way to play this at home easily was on the Salamander Deluxe packs for Saturn and PlayStation, which also added a cool sound test mode with even more unreleased music tracks from the game. It's the graphics that are really the only thing that a reasonable person could knock, as the music is outstanding and the gameplay is vintage Konami. So next time you read somewhere on the internet that Salamander 2 was just alright, or dismissed, ignore it. They don't know what they're talking about, or haven't put in the time. It's clear Konami went all out trying to make this game, both with the presentation and with the gameplay, and I wouldn't be surprised if its cool reception made Konami question what people even want in a shooter anymore. The creative but somewhat rough visuals are the only black mark on an otherwise excellent game. It's not an instant classic, but Salamander 2 was what a 90s kick-ass arcade shooter was all about, and you can take that to the bank. Now, if you're looking for an instant classic, but aren't a fan of the old school original Gradius games, are they just way too hard, frustrating, or a brick wall, feeling like you have to no-death the game or get stuck in checkpoint hell? Or are you just looking for a modernized, console-oriented take that keeps all the good which makes Gradius so loved, and jettisons many of the frustrating bits? Then the PlayStation exclusive and fantastic Gradius Guide is for you. It's considered by many to not only be one of the best PlayStation exclusives, but possibly the best Gradius ever made, and it's absolutely in my top 3. Gaiden has graphics chops, some of the best on the system at the time, and a lot better and cleaner than their recent arcade efforts. Combining 3D models with sprite work ends up very rough and mismatched, like two elements that don't belong in the same game, but Gaiden pulls it off wonderfully, using it sparingly to make the levels come alive. Gaiden also does a great job mixing in nostalgic moments, like the graveyard of old bosses, or the awesome volcano stage from the first Gradius, now with a black hole ripping everything apart as it comes crumbling your way, even affecting you and your shots, along with one of the best music tracks in the game to back it up. There's still the Moai and biological stages, crystals and more, but they all have a unique twist that makes them feel new. Gaiden pulls off that perfect balancing act and makes the old new again in the best way possible. The soundtrack, now on CD, is unlike anything from a previous Gradius game. Despite having some callbacks and remixed tunes, it's all new this time, and Gaiden is the better for it. While not necessarily the best in the series in terms of memorable tunes, it's by far the most eclectic and atmospheric, providing each stage with the right sound. The Moai level uses some exotic instruments mixed with deep chants to possibly be the definitive theme, like flying through a spacefaring Easter Island. You now have 4 ships to choose from, each with their own loadouts, and in a Gradius first, can now rearrange the order you power up. So if you wanted your options as the first choice, followed by speed up, etc., you can do it. There's even a few different shield types to choose from, but overall, the traditional mechanics are all here. The fact it was specifically made for the console market allowed Konami to make the default difficulty more reasonable and give you several lives and credits to practice and complete it. They also made power-ups far more abundant, going a long way toward eliminating that brutal checkpoint recovery of previous games. You can even play co-op, as in Salamander, which eliminates the checkpoints. So you've got a console-exclusive Gradius game that's one of the most creative, best-looking and sounding of the series, with vintage Konami Gradius gameplay to go along with it. Still quite challenging, yet far more accessible and less frustrating than the original Gradius experience. No wonder Gaiden is the favorite of so many, and I agree. What a shame that it remained a Japan exclusive, and so many missed out on this amazing game at the time. One of the best in the series, and about as approachable as it gets. It does everything right and is deserving of a top-tier score. Gradius Gaiden is S+ exceptional. Gradius 4 is another in the series that gets a ton of heat. Some of it's deserved, and some of it's not. As the first true arcade Gradius release since the brutal Part 3, nearly a decade prior, fan expectations were high to see a true comeback for the series, especially after the phenomenal and creative Gaiden on PS1. Unfortunately, when it comes to matching both the aesthetic and oral excellence of Gaiden, Gradius 4 came up short. First, you have the visuals and art design, which are literally a rehash of previous games, with now mostly 3D graphics. The first stage is an homage to the Flaming Suns of Gradius 2. Only 2 did it much better. I mean, who actually thinks that this looks better than this? And while most Gradius games recycled their stage themes, there's something unimaginative about them here. Like you're playing through an uninspired, uglier version of those pixel art classics. Not like Gaiden, that did so much new and creative with every level, while paying homage to them. It's mostly same old here. Now that's not to say there aren't some highlights, like the bobbing and weaving of the lava stage, or the final bass that starts flipping the perspective and direction of play. But these highlights are few and far between, as Gradius 4 needed a whole lot more of that. And not a villain that looks like the brain from Animaniacs.
That was unpleasant.
What makes it even worse is the music. Not bad, but also uninspired and out of place at times, feeling nothing like the catchy tunes the series was known for. Aside from a decent tune here and there, the music in 4 is subpar, and a big part of what hampers the game for me. Running on similar PlayStation hardware to Gaiden, it's hard not to compare the two, and when you do, visually, Orally and creatively, 4 just falls short in every way. But if you thought that the lazy presentation was the end of its troubles, you're in for a rude awakening, as 4 also follows in the footsteps of 3 as being difficult beyond compare. If the third game was an 11 out of 10, 4 would be nipping at its heels as the second hardest Gradius game in existence. At least with part 3, you had some amazing music and nice pixel art to fall back on. The bubble stage in 4 is the first spike, as now they can't be destroyed while they're dividing, making it extremely tough, and a gauntlet that you'll likely need a shield just to absorb some hits and survive. The general lack of slowdown is a good thing, but in the most brutal segments of part 3, it was a saving grace, and a luxury 4 doesn't often provide. Your resource management and ability to keep a shield up better be on point, or you're not making it through most of these stages. Recovery in this game is brutal as ever. Not as unfair as part 3, no, but doing so on the later stages is something only super players need apply. The thing is, all these complaints aren't all that mechanically different from Part 3, or even Part 2 arcade. All were brutally hard, all were near impossible to recover at points, and all were good games. And you know what? So is Gradius 4. It's just nothing we hadn't already seen many times prior. Had it been a beautiful game with incredible music, even if it was derivative, even if it was still hard as balls, it wouldn't have been so universally maligned, as it still plays great and can be a lot of fun, at least when it's not handing you your ass. But if you're going to just do the same old again, your presentation better be on point to keep players coming back, and with Gradius 4, it just wasn't. Gradius 4 is when the series went stale and regressed both visually and orally. After the impressive Gaiden and releasing late in 1999, it was way too little too late, and a big reason why Konami would look to outside talent for their next big installment. There would still be fantastic, traditional Gradius games to follow, but no more in arcades. It was later released on the PS2 with a very welcome save state option and some minor improvements, but not enough to make much of a difference. In retrospect, Gradius 4 is a solid game that skilled players and fans of the series will still enjoy, but it's by far the least successful of the series, and a B-tier game in the lineup.
That was unpleasant.
It's no secret that Konami liked to experiment and had a bit of a thing for 3D shooting games. From the early Gyrus and Falcyon games, or even Ajax, they didn't let the lack of hardware performance stop them from trying. Despite not holding a candle to Sega's superior hardware, Konami gave it another go in '97 with Solar Assault. Though they should have called it Gradius 3D if they wanted to turn more heads. And it's exactly what it looks like, a Gradius-themed 3D rail shooter in the vein of Galaxy Force, only not as impressive visually. Of course, any shooting fan would have jumped at the chance to play a 3D Gradius at the time, though I never saw or played one in the wild. It's got all the common Gradius tropes like the fire stage, Moai, asteroid field, and even a speed stage, which is the coolest of the lot. There's even a simplified power-up system and options. Solar Assault has its callbacks, but it's still a by-the-numbers 3D rail shooter, without much to distinguish it, aside from the Gradius motif. And while the graphics may have been beyond any home console at the time, it paled in comparison to any of Sega's super scalar hardware. And if they were gonna make it Gradius themed, it'd have been cool to have some musical remixes in there, but alas, I didn't find much to like about it. More like techno beats that belong in one of Konami's Drummania games. Gyrus was innovative, and Falcyon pushed the boundaries of the hardware. Solar Assault is just a neat, Gradius-based 3D cabinet. Because I've never played one the way it was meant to be played, it's really not fair to rank. Sitting on a PC via emulation is not the way it was meant to be experienced. Add the fact that emulation is glitchy and often has issues or freezes. And Solar Assault ends up being a novelty to try out, but nothing that'll keep you engrossed for long. Oh yeah, if I actually saw one in real life, I'd be the first to jump in and give it a go, and it could turn out a different beast. But as a cool curiosity to try out at home, it's just above average. But Konami did make one more 3D shooter, and a pretty kick-ass one at that. And it didn't even need some ultra fancy hardware to pull it off. Just one of the biggest franchises of the 80s and the early Konami touch. They did it for Turtles, they did it for Aliens, and in 3D, they did it for G.I. Joe. I can't say that I was the biggest G.I. Joe fan as a kid, being more into Transformers and various comics, but I did watch it plenty and still enjoyed it. Konami knew how to capture that essence of a license and turn a cartoon or movie into a gaming experience, instead of taking the license for granted and churning out a game with some passing references like most others did. They instead stuffed it with every character, every voice sample and callback to the license that they could manage. And if playing through a more violent and manic episode of the cartoon as one of the four Joes got your preteen loins a-roiling, you were all over this game in arcades. At the end of the day though, it's a very by-the-numbers, quarter-munching shoot-fest without a lot of mechanics to keep you coming back. There's no roll, jump, or other fun ways to change things up. The levels are pretty awesome and flow into each other as you slowly infiltrate bases and fight all the cool villains like Destro and the Baroness. So it's the presentation and novelty that keeps you going. One huge, perplexing miss, however, is the lack of any character variety. Playing as Duke, Snake Eyes, Scarlet, or Roadblock, they're literally identical in every way aside from how they look. What a miss to have each of them unique with their own weapons and abilities. And I wonder if Konami just ran out of time and budget and pushed it out. G.I. Joe is the kind of game you really have to play on a big screen, and with at least a friend or two to truly appreciate. It's nothing groundbreaking, but the sheer insanity of it all, and seeing how much of the show is packed into every part of the game, is worth the ride. The art and level design is cool and still holds up in my opinion, much more so than low-res ugly polygons. It's the game it was designed to be, and I give it 3.5 out of 5. Yo Joes! Gradius 5 by brilliant developer Treasure, the game many of you have been waiting for. The awesome Gradius that's not really a Gradius, and a perpetual favorite. Why is it so popular if it's not much like any Gradius? Because it's a damn good game. If you're gonna be different, if you're gonna change it up and throw the old out for the new, especially with a classic, then it better be good. After the derivative Gradius 4 and its poor reception, it was time for a fresh take, and boy is it fresh. Konami handed it off to the makers of Radiant Silvergun and Ikaruga, so you know it was gonna be good, and you know it was gonna be hard. Hard enough to where most who played it only ever made it so far, but they kept coming back, and that's a hallmark of an excellent game. Gradius 5 actually does adopt a lot of the series mechanics. Your weapon loadouts are similar, the power-up systems are the same, and your options are still the most important tool in your arsenal, even more so here, as you now have a freeze option that lets you lock them in place, making for invaluable mechanics and strategy to help you through this brutal game. But that's where the similarities end. The first to go was the large hitbox of the old ship, now a tiny set of 2x2 pixels. We're talking cave small, and that's so they can throw a ton of bullets and dense patterns your way, and expect you to dodge them. In Gradius of old, the checkpoint system and recovery could be brutal, and one mistake could cost you your run. Not here. You respawn at death, and it's not very hard to recover your options when you do. But unless you know this game like the back of your hand, and even if you do, you're gonna be dying. A lot. Much like Treasure's other shmups, you won't be making much progress until you memorize every level and every boss, to the point of perfection, and requires a level of expertise that many won't achieve. But unlike traditional Gradius, because of the respawns and ability to power back up, you can use your lives and continues to get just a bit farther every time. And as you play the game more, it unlocks more continues to give you a better chance. But most importantly, as you fail, you'll want to replay it again and again. And that's what makes Gradius 5 and others like it special. Part of that is the killer presentation. Despite going their own way in terms of art design, Treasure made sure to incorporate all forms of homages throughout, and much like Gradius Gaiden, it incorporates them in such fun and creative ways that it often feels like the old become new again. You don't have to wait long, as on the very first stage, you're dodging and destroying what look like mini-planets on an infinite scrolling plane, but are actually the core from Salamander. On stage 2, you don't just get a set of classic Gradius and Salamander bosses, but you get a kick-ass musical remix of Poison of Snake for the battle. The first time I played Gradius 5, by the end of stage 2, I was already sold. Now, I won't overdo it with the hyperbole, as though the updated graphics and stage creativity is outstanding. It's definitely not as varied or quite on the level of the phenomenal Gradius Gaiden in that regard. The same can't be said for the bosses though, which really step it up to insane levels here, with some of the most unusual and varied encounters of the series. Treasure's design ideology is constantly on display, as every stage area feels like a complex puzzle to learn and overcome. Where to place yourself, how to position your options, moving at the right time. If you don't like the idea of memorizing nearly each and every part of a level and boss, Gradius 5 may not be for you. Yes, most shooting games are this way, but Treasure always takes it to another level. Another aspect that's similar to Radiant Silvergun is the length, taking over an hour to complete. Talk about a gauntlet. Actually clearing the game and keeping your wits about you for so long will make you feel like you really did take on the Bacterion Empire and live to tell the story. Special mention goes to the killer sound effects, which really sell the experience. While the music is good, it's more of a techno vibe on an epic scale, but isn't the most memorable part of the oral experience. It's the cacophony of sounds, grand explosions, laser fire, and every little detail that really stands out. I don't often comment on the exceptional sound effects in a game, but Gradius 5 is so well done that it almost makes up for the less memorable soundtrack. So is Part 5 in my personal top 3 of all Konami shooters? No. Treasure shmups are first and foremost a technical exercise. Games that require such utter perfection and memorization to play successfully that it's hard to appreciate the rest of the journey at times. The game is brilliant, and when you finally have its number, much like Radiant Silvergun, it's a joy to play through, if not overly long. The presentation is so outstanding that you want to see farther and farther, so you keep plugging away. But it's also a game that I'd sometimes rather watch than play myself, just so I can enjoy the spectacle and how cool it is. Because the process of playing can be so grueling and nerve-wracking that it becomes solely about the exercise to survive. For the most expert of players who will loop it and play it for score, it doesn't get much better than this. And it's my favorite treasure shooter, more so than either RSG or Ikaruga. But at the end of the day, I'm a bit too old school, and prefer my Gradius 2, Salamander, and even Gaiden. That doesn't change the fact that Gradius 5 is a masterpiece, and for many, their favorite in the series. Treasure really outdid themselves in doing the Gradius name justice, creating a perfect swan song to the series, and crafting one of the best shooting games of the modern era. It's an S-tier game without a shadow of a doubt. If this was going to be the last Gradius ever made, then it was one for the ages. Do you like your Gradius on the go, or just your shmups in general? Aside from all the portable ports you've seen so far, Konami also made a good handful of exclusive shooters for playing on the crapper. What, you think it started with phones? I've been shooting on the shitter since the 8-bit days, and it was a great way to keep friends from asking to use my Game Boy, I tell you what. Okay, I'll be honest here. I didn't actually get to ever own a Game Boy. My weapon of choice was a Turbo Express, so I got to play the real Hue card of Gradius and Salamander with a bootleg converter, and it was awesome. Suck it. But it also means I totally missed out on some great early Game Boy games, and I'm the poorer for it. so I've slowly been discovering them over the last few years, including the ones from Konami. For this Game Boy segment, I wanted to do something special and introduce a friend of mine and gaming industry veteran, Rob Strangman, a huge Konami and Gradius fan. He's also the creator of the original Splatterhouse fan page, West Mansion, and contributor to many great retro books, like The Guide to Retro Horror by Hardcore 101. He even has his own channel called Dyer and Betty, which you can find a link to in the description. So I thought, who better than Rob, someone that did grow up playing a Game Boy, to give you a quick recap on what makes these games special. So take it away, Rob.
I had no real interest in the Game Boy before 1994. When Nintendo introduced the Super Game Boy for the Super NES that year, I decided I should get one and check out some of the games I'd missed. I knew there were Castelvania and Contra games for the Game Boy, and they were among the first games I picked up, but there were others that were more important, namely the first two Gradius games. It was definitely a Gradius game, despite the manual giving us some BS about how you were some kind of intergalactic space cop trying to apprehend King Nemesis with your Proteus 911 starfighter. No, you were piloting the Warp Rattler and fighting the Bacterians in what I could only call Gradius' greatest hits. It mixed elements of the original games, Gradius 2, and the MSX games into a great, if slightly predictable package, and there was no mistaking the classic Gradius music that had been reproduced faithfully. Konami did an amazing job on them. It's not as good as the original NES port, but it does have a lot of variety in levels and bosses. Konami later re-released it in Volume 1 of their Game Boy Collection series, upgraded and colorized, and now renamed Gradius in all territories. The gameplay is solid, it's not too difficult, there's not much in the way of slowdown. In short, it's one of, if not the best, of the early Game Boy shooters. This is definitely an A-tier game, a rarity for a shooter on the Game Boy.
I'm gonna agree with Rob here. Very solid, portable shooter with a good hard mode and shockingly good soundtrack. This is A-tier Game Boy.
When I first played Gradius the Interstellar Assault, I thought for sure it was just going to be another Gradius Greatest Hits game like the original Nemesis. But man, I couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of starting in a sky stage where you collect power-ups, your fleet is decimated, and you suddenly find yourself being chased by a giant battleship through an asteroid field, finally losing it in the caverns of a giant asteroid it's too big to get into. You fly into the ruins inside the asteroid, which would have felt at home in one of the MSX games, and finally emerge into an organic section straight out of Salamander or R-Type. The game never breaks up into different stages. Instead, it transitions from one set piece to another, making it feel more epic in scope. You go from being captured at the end of the first stage to escaping the giant battleship that chased you originally, then descending to a planet and ultimately infiltrating the underground base there. The graphics are about the best you'll see in a Game Boy game, the gameplay is top-notch, and the music is completely original. Aside from now having a weapon select option at the start for your type of missiles, double shot, and laser types, it plays just like your typical Gradius, only easier. Much like Nemesis, it's not too difficult. Gradius the Interstellar Assault is one of the best shooters on the original Game Boy, and well worth the playthrough for any Gradius fan.
It was 10 years, not until 2001, when Konami gave us another portable Gradius exclusive, with Galaxies on the Game Boy Advance. And as cool and cute as the Game Boy Gradius games were, Galaxies takes it to a whole new level, though I have to admit, it comes with a caveat that really hurts the experience for me. First, the good. Galaxies looks fantastic. Not just in terms of color and pixel art, but the creative design and variety of the levels. It's up there with Gaiden as one of the most unique and original of the series. It may not look like much watching it here on a modern display, but keep in mind, it was designed for a smaller display and looked really nice on a Game Boy Advance. The opening starfield and stage is filled with blue and purple nebulas. The crystal stage features stormy clouds with lighting effects lighting up the sky, and the very next fiery level puts the lackluster opening stage of Gradius 4 to shame, and the creativity continues with falling volcanoes, purple waterfalls, and generally colorful and dynamic backdrops. Galaxies is a nice looking game. Now for the bad. I only wish I could say the same for the sound. Now, I don't want to put all of this on Konami, because some of the actual tunes here are decent, with good composition behind them. But oh my god, is the Game Boy Advance supposed to sound this bad? I never owned one before, so I'm asking this honestly. Because if I'd bought one back in the day and it sounded like this, I'd have thrown it out the window. It's like listening to an alarm clock. The sample quality is just so low and repetitive. Like Konami had to strangle a cheap keyboard just to get it to play. This is game sound in the year 2000? I don't think so. It'd take a blindfold, a ball gag, and an 8-ball to make me like this music. To be fair, there are many good compositions here. But it feels like Konami had to struggle against hardware limitations. When the original black and white Game Boy games sound better, you know there's a problem. The gameplay is again, classic Gradius. No real gimmicks here and just a few loadouts to choose from. If you're looking for another slightly less challenging Gradius, something below the console-friendly Gaiden, then you'll have a great time with Galaxies. Recovery is much more manageable, and the harder difficulties will give most any player a good option for their skill level. A minor complaint are the speed-ups, which tend to be way too fast after just a couple, making your ship too twitchy to keep from making a mistake. So in Galaxies, it's best not to exceed a couple for most of the game. Had the music been on point, I'd be giving Galaxies an A-tier rating as the best shooter on the Game Boy Advance, which isn't saying much, as it's still the best on the Game Boy Advance. It plays really well and is a must for Gradius fans. The visuals are really well done, and it's even a good length on par with a console game, with only the sound letting it down and knocking a full grade off the experience. And that's with me turning off the audio and listening to something else. And unless you have some blindingly fierce nostalgia for this game's tunes, I suggest you do the same. Of all the portable Gradius, Parodius, and Twinbee ports and collections released, only one original Twinbee game was produced in 1990, the same year as Nemesis Game Boy, and dare I say, it's as equally a good remake as the original Gradius was. If anything, despite being black and white, the graphics are improved over the original game, with a lot more variety and detail in the stages and bosses. Just like Nemesis, it pulls from various Twinbee games and it's the better for it, as the original was quite bare bones. The music is equally good, with catchy and hummable renditions of the original tunes. It plays fast and responsive, while of course toning it down versus the brutal arcade original. But the Game Boy release was only the beginning, as it also saw a multitude of enhanced ports down the road. On the Super Game Boy, Color, and the cream of the crop, a completely redone PSP game by the incredible M2. And in typical M2 fashion, it's everything you'd expect it to be. Beautiful redone graphics, spot-on gameplay, and lots of extra touches only they'd know to include. It's not perfect, as the 2-player mode is missing, and some of the stage bosses and levels are slightly rearranged, for better or worse. But if you've never played M2's Twinbee Da on PSP, I highly recommend you do. As part of a near-complete Twinbee collection on PSP, there's no better and more accurate way to play all these games on the go. The original Game Boy game alone is A-tier for the hardware, and this modern remake on the PSP is even better. I'm giving Twinbee Da an A+, for the multitude of great ways to play it. And as part of an S-tier Twinbee collection by M2, it's a must-play. Speaking of M2, who better to yet again revive the dormant Gradius franchise 5 years later with Rebirth, part of M2's Rebirth line for Nintendo's WiiWare platform, along with Contra and Castelvania. Although it's more of a reboot than a rebirth, as M2 went old school and created a new Gradius game as if it released back in the late 80s. Graphics and all, it's not just a rehash of arcade Gradius, as M2, being big fans of the MSX platform, also included a handful of references and homage to those games as well. And if you're looking for a reimagining, the same only new, then you'll really dig Rebirth. But if you're expecting some wild effects and new additions, don't get your hopes up. Rebirth is very much rooted in the originals, so it's a very by the numbers, even if inspired take on the classic games. It looks great with nice modern touches and some scaling effects, and you'll still see the classic levels with new twists, like being able to choose whether the volcano stage gets iced over and becomes a different environment, even with its own unique stage boss. Some of the bosses in general are a standout, including a really cool take on the Moai boss. The music was done by legendary composer Manabu Namiki, though I have to admit it's not my favorite of his work. While good, the tracks don't really stay with me, not like the originals. And it plays perfectly, in addition to being very player-friendly and balanced toward a console market, at least without cranking up the settings. However, the game is very much on the short side, even for an early Gradius game, with only 5 levels and 20 minutes or less to completion. In fairness, it was a low-cost, downloadable game, not a full-fledged release, so M2's not to blame for that, as given the likely time and budget constraints, they packed each of the levels with great gameplay worthy of the series. So while not the definitive Gradius experience by any means, and not a massive revival on a grand scale like we may have hoped for, it was still more than welcome.
Hello, Motoo.
Okay, maybe not quite. Roll your eyes all you want at mobile games, but Konami made a solid one in 2004, of course Japan only, on the NTT Docomo Foma 900i line of phones, a 320x240 resolution flip phone, years before Apple and smartphones made mobile gaming ubiquitous. So while something like this would be common today, this was pretty darn impressive in 2004. Sure, it runs at 10 FPS, and the control looks a bit funky, but this is a full-fledged Gradius game, and not a cheap mobile cache-in. Complete levels and even an expanded power-up system, full range of movement and cycling option formations, unique sets of enemies and bosses. Even the music here is quite well done. There was even a more obscure variant called Gradius Neo Imperial, where you play as Big Core instead. As you can imagine, footage is scarce. Konami really went to bat and tried to make a good game, certainly meant for casual play, with instant respawns that start you with 2 options right out of the gate. So yeah, still a mobile game, but a decent one for its time. The same can't be said, unfortunately, for the newer Twinbee line Go-Go, as though running on more modern tech in 2013 really is just a short time waster with a Twinbee skin, meant to cash in on the property. You can only move left to right, enemies don't fire, there's no ground bombs, and you're simply dodging side to side while shooting, taking advantage of bell power-ups which don't cycle anymore. There's a fever mode granting temp invincibility after hitting enough combos, and you can upgrade your ship in various ways as you play, using in-game currency. One of those games I can't really judge, meant for an online gaming service where players could make high score runs and compete against one another, even if the game itself is quite shallow. It's also no longer available unless you can find a way to emulate it online. So you think you know Konami shooters, but I'll bet there's a handful that you don't. I sure hadn't. Games that were obscure, never ported anywhere, of various quality, and generally forgotten. And while I'm not going to linger on any or rank them all, they do deserve a mention as part of the Konami pantheon. Even if they didn't gain much notoriety, some are actually decent, and a couple really quite good. The most unusual of which is Tobii Polystars, arcade only and using the Panasonic M2 system, a board that no emulation even exists for. So not only can I not review it, I can't even play it. Thankfully, there's a really cool channel I follow called Video Game Esoterica, and he owns the incredibly rare arcade board, and he was kind enough to let me use some of his footage.
It seems like the developers at Konami had a ton of fun in making this game, and between the colorful art style, the fun character models, the quirkiness, the really upbeat soundtrack and everything, the sum of its parts makes a game that feels unique and wholly special.
So if you want to see more of this early PlayStation era looking game, Video Game Esoterica has a full gameplay video along with commentary. I did say Konami liked to experiment, And Scooter Shooter is a perfect example. A split-screen competitive shooter where you race toward the center before squaring off against a friend or the computer. Getting hit along the way slows you down and depletes some of your life, and only the first to reach the midpoint is rewarded with some power-ups. Then you go PvP, and to the winner go the spoils. A simple concept, but not one that took off, as PvP competitive shmupping never has, or has yet to become a thing. And playing against the computer wasn't all that engaging. Most of Konami's other games came during the early 80s, like Megazone, a basic but competent tank shooter with a music beat that's oddly entrancing. Kind of primal and gets you into a zone while playing. Something about this one makes me want to throw on a loincloth and dance around a campfire. And for a shooter, that's a good thing. Next came Finalizer Super Transformation, where you oddly start over a real-world map. Cuba, to be precise. Grab some plantains on the way for the trip, then work your way north. I was actually interested to see where I'd end up, as I always wanted to fly over Iceland. But the geography turned into some random landscape that I couldn't make out. You quickly upgrade to a mech, and realize it has a neat weapon arm mechanic where you can grab different loadouts for each arm, or a shield that you can control with the right arm. This one doesn't have any music or beats though, unfortunately, but it does get pretty damn fast and frantic as you progress, with some seriously fast homing enemies that ram you at high speed. It's actually a good bit of fun for a quick high score run. From arcade to MSX, we have Sky Jaguar, a very early 16 kilobyte game, so don't expect anything fancy. Truth be told, when I first heard Sky Jaguar, it reminded me of Trevor McFur on the, you guessed it, Jaguar. Only sad to say that this game is still better than Trevor McFur. I was afraid it may have a sluggish pace, but despite the choppy scrolling, this is a fast game. The bullets get fast, the enemies get fast, and you'll die pretty fast too, or at least soon enough. Another one that's more fun than you'd think for a quick high score run, but you really need to have nostalgia for it to come back to. Seriously, what is it with Konami and Moai? If you think it all started with Gradius, think again, as Pipples on MSX has them in spades. I'm just surprised that they didn't shoot at me here. Really, this is nerve-wracking. I'm just expecting any of these walls to blast rings at any moment. Pipples is actually really neat. The scrolling is smooth, which is nice. The music is catchy. And the mechanic of playing a shooter through walls is pretty unique, and once enemies start flying over the walls unimpeded, things get hectic quick. Pipples is a lot of fun and my favorite of the bunch here. Fantastic game with a lot of strategy and reflex involved. Had it ever hit arcades, I could totally see this one taking off. In fact, it's so good I gotta give it a ranking. This is an A-tier game for 1985, highly underrated and unknown. Give it a shot, but keep an eye on the Moai, cause they are watching. Always watching. Of all the games to get an Arcade Archives release, Flak Attack did. For nostalgia, I suppose, as it's a basic, decent shooter with a ground bombing mechanic, but not anything noteworthy. Not until you reach the bosses anyway, where it turns into an odd, overhead run and gun with you often circling around them and shooting or bombing the direction you're facing. It's honestly kind of weird, and not sure if it fits the style of game, but it is different. This was a later game in 1987, the same year of Toaplan's Hishizami, so while it looks alright, there's no comparison really. Not bad, but quite mediocre. Finally, we have Battleandus, another good one, with one of the freshest takes and expansions on the Space Invader concept that I've seen. Not only is it creative visually, throwing in all kinds of unique enemies and constant bosses, but beneath the surface is an incredible amount of strategy to progressing beyond the harder levels. Everything moves much faster than your typical Invaders clone, creating an intensity where any single enemy is a threat, not simply dodging bullets to stay alive, as just one enemy making it down the screen and up that wall means you're toast. Enemies making mad dashes toward the wall. Champions launching grenades while blocking your shots with a shield. The farther you get, the greater the madness. And the cooler the bosses too. Battleandus is another good one that's super fun for a quick high score run. Everybody's gotta start somewhere, and if you go back far enough, In this case, 1979. You'll find some cheap clone games that Konami used to get their feet wet. Literally everyone was ripping off Space Invaders in 79, but by 1981, with their next release, they were already experimenting with some cool ideas like Tactician, where you start each level by drawing out a shield before the enemy starts swarming down to destroy it, and if you hit the red orb, it chain reacts, killing everything nearby. The End was a Galaxian clone with a twist, where you start with 3 sets of green blocks, and the enemy's goal is to take them all away as they swoop down. Once all your defenses are gone, it's game over. And Konami's final clone was Juno First, playing like Defender only in the vertical plane, where you can control your forward and back movement, though it's not really fair to call it a clone, as aside from the basic concept, it brings its own flavor to the table. The most obvious is the really cool aesthetic and particle effects that make it stand out, and the best of Konami's early games. One of my favorite things about Konami and their love for shooters was how they managed to squeeze them into anything they could, including many of their other games as bonuses, as many of the staff worked on them as side projects, for the simple love of the genre. And of all Konami's releases, it was the Tokimeki Memorial Series, a dating simulation with an original concept by creator Hideo Kojima that was packed to the brim with side games. Oh yeah, you've likely heard of Force Gear hidden on the PC Engine release, an excellent caravan game that M2 resurrected for the PC Engine Mini, but it was just one of many shooters packed into this series of dating sims. Of course, you'd first need to properly swoon the ladies before you could score. Twinbee was on both the PC Engine and Saturn/PlayStation version of the original Tokimeki. Both are a caravan-style time attack mode, resembling either the original Twinbee on PC Engine or the newer Poppin' Twinbee art style on the 32-bit versions. Speaking of Saturn and PlayStation, Tokimeki had a set of all-new shooters for them as well. The Saturn port got Scythe, not a caravan score attack, but a single-stage, horizontal shooter with a techno vibe that takes you through various locales and has some pretty nice 32-bit era graphics to go with it. Because it's so short, it packs a lot of enemies and backgrounds into its runtime, almost like a sampler of various stages strung together, taking you from the ocean to sea caverns teeming with dino-like aquatic creatures, then a city skyline with completely unique enemies, including a pretty creepy final boss amongst the clouds that has a lot more phases than you'd ever expect. It all has a Darius-like vibe and could have made a cool complete game. The PlayStation Tokimeki got a 3D game, because of course it did. A rail shooter in this case called Stardust Symphony X. Why are you only getting some pics? Because it's so obscure there isn't a single video of it online that I could ask for permission to use. And if you think I'm playing through an entire Japanese dating sim just to capture some footage of this somewhat ugly looking PS1 era 3D game, no. Tokimeki Memorial 2 got Space Ring Fighter and Melting Point, two similar games that once again, not a single video source I could find exists, along with Go Driller and Conquer, two other Tokimeki series games with the same problem. And finally, I did find video for Star Crasher, not of the highest quality, but beggars can't be choosers at this point. If it wasn't for Hardcore 101, we wouldn't have these images and clips at all. And if you want even more images, clips, and even some save files to help play these hidden shooters, I have a link in my description to their page. Zone of Ender's second runner on PS2 and Xbox 360 had a Gradius minigame of its own called Zeradius. The main game actually has a battle against the Vic Viper, but if you pause the game and enter the Konami code, you'll be taken to Zeradius, a 3D score attack mode with Gradius power-up mechanics, consisting of a few waves, including a tunnel of Moai. It's kind of hard to see what you're doing, and dodging isn't anything special, with the best part being the music from the original Gradius game. But in my opinion, the cream of the crop and best hidden game by far was the aforementioned Force Gear on PC Engine, with huge sprites and nice visuals, along with a great music track to replay the mode endlessly for score. It pays homage to the Gradius and Salamander series, but is completely unique in terms of mechanics. Aside from a standard shot and secondary weapon, you have an option that acts as a shield, always positioned the opposite direction of your movement. When in front, absorbing enemy fire and providing a powerful beam for high damage. M2 did everyone a service by including this gem on the PC Engine Mini, and as a caravan mode, let alone a rare one in the horizontal plane. Easily the coolest and could have been used in a competition. Konami also had some really cool shooting Easter eggs in some of their games. The one I remember most was in Blades of Steel on NES, playing against friends for two main reasons. One, to get into fights, and two, to play the Gradius boss battle during the intermission. You could only move up and down and had a very limited time to destroy the core before it moved on, but it stuck with me. Legend of Mystical Ninja took it farther, with the entire first stage of the original, even with a cool SNES remix tune. Ganbare Goemon on PlayStation had a totally reimagined version of Gradius it called Comedius. Same original song remixed as you ride your Kame, aka Turtle, through a very cool looking and unique underwater level, obligatory Chinese palace, and colorful Parodia-style boss. The second Goemon game has part of Stage 2 from Zezek you can play, and two of Konami's most popular platformers, Rocket Knight Adventures on Mega Drive and Sparkster on the SNES. Both feature shooting levels. Rocket Knight even has some of the bosses straight out of Gradius. And not to leave out the trusty Famicom, Yume Penguin Monogatari features some shooting levels as well. And I'm probably still missing some, but you get the idea. You know it's the end of an era when a company starts homaging itself. The writing is on the wall, and the time of shooting games as a mainstream genre was long past. Instead of creating new entries in a storied series like Gradius, with a team so far removed from the original talent that created the classics, it only made sense to create an all-new series as a love letter to what came before. But the genre was at a low point, relegated to elite circles and enthusiasts. So Konami needed a hook, something to appeal to a broader Japanese audience and attract attention. And the answer? Girls. Scantily clad girls. And called it Otomedius, meaning otome or young girl with Gradius. Otomedius. Get it? I can't say that I'm a fan of the ship design, looking like each girl is wearing the ship around their waist, kinda like a child wearing a rubber ducky while floating in a pool. But if the game delivered, I could overlook all that. And as a short, competitive arcade release, it was decent, if not impressive, retaining the power-up system from Gradius, and homaging familiar ships from Konami lore. You have the Vic Viper, and Lord British, of course, though I always pictured Lord British to be more of a Bayonetta type. But there's plenty more variety of girl ships, each with their own weapon systems and loadout. You choose from 3 of 4 stages to play, along with the difficulty for each, which is a neat touch, and then go for a high score. But presentation-wise, it all kind of falls flat. And no, I don't mean the ladies. The creativity is there, especially with the penguin motif, which I love, where you can spot them in the background doing all sorts of penguin-y things. Lounging, blindfolded games, driving a tank. They're just everywhere and fit the cute and silly theme well. But here, it's all static. None of them are moving, like they've been frozen in time, kind of cold and honestly surreal. Gone are the manic scenes of penguin tomfoolery from the Parodius games, with animation and movement. Whether it's lack of time, budget, or programming chops, it's a missed opportunity. Colorful, sure, but nowhere near that of earlier games. For the console release on Xbox 360, retitled Otomedius Gorgeous, M2 came into the picture and made an originally short game into something more appropriate, adding a few more levels to increase the length, along with a host of new features. The new longer arrange mode was changed to a widescreen aspect, and the burst system from the scoring-oriented arcade mode removed. While the extra levels are cool, there's not much new mechanics to arrange. If anything, the burst mode gone and scoring is kind of nerfed, so it doesn't do all that much to make an average game any better. It does fare better musically, having a huge amount of content, including a ton of CD tracks released for the game. They really went all out on the musical side. Quantity isn't quality though, and I wouldn't say that any of it is something that I'd be listening to regularly. However, the best part of the game for me is the ability to tailor the experience, as they created a handful of wonderful remixes of the original tunes, and allow you to choose which to use. Armed with the right music, and with the difficulty turned up to very hard, Ultimedias finally showed me a good time. No, not even M2 could polish this game enough to raise it above mediocrity, but with the right tweaks, it does let you turn it into something more that's your jam, taking an average C-tier game and turning it into a B- for me. Apparently, the bosoms of Gradius were enough of a hit for a sequel just a few years later, with Ultimedias excellent, and if going by intro alone, it certainly was. It wasn't just the intro, as the visuals also got a major overhaul, now with a lot more depth to the 3D landscapes and perspective, actual moving backdrops and lots of animation, making the rest of the game as pleasing to the eyes as the cleavage on display. Okay, maybe not as pleasing, but it was definitely a step up, even if still mediocre in terms of what the Xbox 360 could do. They also went all out with the characters and extras, with tons of downloadable content and customization, and that extends to the soundtrack, which was again above and beyond in terms of content, with themes for every character and then some with tons of DLC. But again, despite the dearth of content, I didn't find too many standouts to get me excited, though quite customizable with a lot of depth and unlockables, including weapon cards picked up from defeated enemies, adding a good bit of replay value. The downside is the game itself is overly easy, even on some of the higher difficulty settings, making actually replaying the game to continue unlocking things more of a chore than a pleasure. Great for beginners actually, but not a lot of meat for those that have been playing Gradius and similar for over a decade. At least the original was short and arcade-based, so it made sense. There's just so much thrown at you here to keep you busy, but the game behind it never did it for me. I know a lot have nostalgia for this series and enjoy it, but anytime I play it, it simply reminds me of how the mighty had fallen, and why I didn't spend much time on them, or the genre in general during that era. It's alright at best. Another very average shmup with an extraordinary amount of content to try and make up for it. So thank God, we had the amazing Indian fan scene to truly give us the Konami experience of old. Fans and programmers who knew how to capture the essence of what made Konami shooters great, with both homage and fresh ideas of their own. Konami may have been no more, but their legacy lived on, with some of the most outstanding games in their stead. Super Hydora by Locomalito, one of the freshest Gradius-style games ever made. Or if you're looking for a true Gradius experience, you have to play Spaloose, a completely free game that's as close to the originals as it gets, and packed with content. Paro Paro is a Parodius clone that's absolutely fantastic, and another game I covered in my best free shmups video as a must-play, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. From the earliest days with shameless clones like Gradius 95 and Chemesis, to actual sequels like Spaceman Motoo or homages like Cetasius, there's no shortage of ways to relive the old with something new. There's so many in fact, it's near impossible to cover. Despite Konami being a very different company today, they've recently again shown interest in the genre and resurrecting their best franchises, while also developing the new. Their current game in development, Signy, has some insane production values, with former Pixar talent on board that I've been testing and providing feedback for, and who's to say that we may not see a Gradius 6 someday soon, as if it's gonna happen, there's no better time than the present. If you really enjoyed this type of in-depth look at an entire library of games, please don't miss my other epic videos just like it, featuring every shooter on the Mega Drive, PC Engine, Toaplan shooters, and more, and you can check them out right here.